Chapter 1. The examination Professor McGonagall's steps echoed through the empty corridors of Hogwarts as she made her way to the hospital wing, a manila folder tucked beneath her arm containing Harry Potter's class schedule. 3 days had passed since the sorting, and she needed to discuss his course selections with Madame Pomfrey before the mandatory first-year medical examinations concluded. The September morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting elongated shadows across the stone floor. Shadows that seemed to reach toward her with grasping fingers, though she dismissed the fanciful thought with characteristic pragmatism. She had been thinking about Harry Potter more than she cared to admit since the sorting ceremony. The boy had looked so small at the house tables, so quietly grateful for every scrap of kindness shown to him. When she had handed him his schedule that first night, his stammered, "Thank you, Professor," had carried a weight that suggested he had not often been thanked for existing, let alone been provided for. It was a tone she recognized, one that made her stomach clench with memory of that November night 10 years ago when she had watched the Dursleys for an entire day before Dumbledore arrived. The hospital wing door stood slightly ajar, and she could hear Madame Pomfrey's voice drifting through the gap, gentle but clinical in the way that suggested a routine examination in progress. "Just raise your arms above your head, dear. That's right." McGonagall paused at the threshold, her hand on the door handle, as something in Pomfrey's tone shifted. The Mediwitch's voice had gone very quiet, very careful, the way it sounded when she discovered something that concerned her professionally. McGonagall had heard that tone before, during her own years as a student, when Pomfrey examined children who had arrived at school bearing the evidence of what happened in homes where love was scarce. "Mr. Potter," Pomfrey's voice came again, and now McGonagall could hear the slight tremor beneath the professional calm. "Can you tell me about this scar here, on your shoulder?" I fell down the stairs," came Harry's voice, so quiet McGonagall had to strain to hear it. "When I was little, Uncle Vernon said I was clumsy." McGonagall felt her breath catch. She had pushed open the door without conscious thought, stepping into the bright, antiseptic space of the hospital wing, just as Madame Pomfrey was gently guiding Harry to lie back on the examination table. The boy was thin, far thinner than she had realized beneath his oversized school robes, and his skin held the pallor of someone who had spent too many years deprived of both sunlight and adequate nutrition. "Professor McGonagall," Pomfrey said, looking up with relief that quickly gave way to something deeper and more troubling. "Perhaps you could stay. As Mr. Potter's head of house, there are some things you should know about his medical history." Harry turned his head toward McGonagall, his green eyes wide with something that looked distressingly like panic. "Did I do something wrong, Professor? I can go back to my dormitory if you need me to." "You have done nothing wrong, Mr. Potter," McGonagall said quickly, moving closer to his bedside. The speed with which he had offered to remove himself, the way he held his body as if expecting blow or banishment, sent alarm bells ringing through her mind. "Madame Pomfrey is simply completing your medical examination. It is required for all first-year students." She watched as Harry's shoulders relaxed marginally, though his hands remained clenched at his sides. Pomfrey was running diagnostic spells with her wand, and McGonagall could see the slight frown deepening between the Mediwitch's brows with each charm she cast. "Professor," Pomfrey said carefully, not taking her eyes off the readings that were appearing in the air above Harry's prone form, "I think it would be best if Mr. Potter rested here for a moment while I complete these scans. Perhaps you and I could speak privately." But McGonagall found herself rooted to the spot, staring at the diagnostic results that hung in the air like accusations. She had seen these spells performed before, during her years as deputy headmistress, and she understood what the readings meant. Severe malnutrition, stunted growth, vitamin deficiencies, and there, highlighted in a sickly yellow glow, the traces of at least 6 separate healed fractures across his ribs and left arm. "Mr. Potter," she heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady. "How tall do you believe you should be?" Harry blinked at her, confusion replacing the panic in his eyes. I don't know, Professor. I've always been small. Aunt Petunia says I take after my father's side, but in a bad way." McGonagall felt something cold settle in her stomach. James Potter had been nearly 6 feet tall. She remembered dancing with him at his wedding, remembered how Lily had to stand on her toes, even in heels, to reach his shoulder. Harry, at 11 years old, should have been showing signs of the height he would inherit. Instead, he looked more like a child of 9, perhaps 10 at most. "Poppy," she said quietly, "what do the scans indicate about his nutritional status?" Pumphrey's silence was answer enough, but she spoke anyway, her voice professionally detached in the way that meant she was holding back fury. "Chronic malnutrition, consistent with prolonged periods of insufficient caloric intake. Growth hormone deficiencies, likely stemming from psychological stress and food restriction. Evidence suggests," she paused, glancing at Harry, who had gone very still on the examination table, "systematic deprivation rather than mere poverty." McGonagall looked down at Harry, who was staring at the ceiling with the blank expression of someone who had learned to disappear inside themselves when adults discussed his failings. She remembered that expression. She had seen it 10 years ago on the face of a 15-month-old baby lying on a doorstep, already learning that crying would not bring comfort. "The fractures," she said, the words scraping against her throat. "Old, very old, some dating back to when he was quite young." Pumphrey's hands moved over Harry's body with practiced gentleness, and McGonagall noticed how he flinched each time, as if expecting pain from any touch, no matter how careful. "Mr. Potter, can you tell me about your living situation with your relatives?" Harry's eyes flicked between the two women, and McGonagall could see him calculating how much truth was safe to share. "I lived in the cupboard under the stairs," he said finally, as if this were a perfectly normal arrangement, "until my Hogwarts letters started coming. Then Dudley got scared and Uncle Vernon moved me to Dudley's second bedroom." The words hung in the air like a curse. McGonagall felt the world tilt sideways, felt 10 years of careful professional composure threatening to crack. She had known. Some part of her had always known that leaving Harry with the Dursleys was wrong, had carried the memory of Vernon Dursley's cruel little eyes and Petunia's thin-lipped disapproval like a stone in her chest. But she had trusted Dumbledore's wisdom, had believed in the protection that bloodkin was supposed to provide. "How often?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Were you fed?" "When I was good," Harry answered automatically, then seemed to realize what he had said, and paled further. "I mean, I was always fed. Aunt Petunia made sure I had food. Sometimes I was too excited to eat." McGonagall exchanged a long look with Pumphrey over Harry's head. The boy was lying, but lying in the way children did when they had been taught that honesty about their suffering would only bring more suffering. His thin wrists, the prominent bones of his shoulders, the way he had carefully rationed his food at the welcome feast. It painted a picture that made her feel sick with delayed recognition. "Mr. Potter," McGonagall said gently, "would you like Madame Pumphrey to provide you with some nutrition potions? They will help you feel stronger." The hope that flashed across Harry's face was quickly suppressed, replaced by wariness. "Do I have to pay for them?" he asked quietly. The Dursleys said. They said Hogwarts was expensive enough without adding extra costs. McGonagall felt something break inside her chest. She thought of the vaults beneath Gringotts, filled with gold that belonged to this child, gold he had never been told about. She thought of Dumbledore's gentle certainty that Harry was better off not knowing about his wealth, better off remaining humble and unassuming. She thought of 10 years of suffering that could have been prevented with a single visit, a single question, a single moment of caring more about Harry Potter's well-being than about the abstract concept of protection. "There is no cost, Mr. Potter," she said, and her voice was rougher than she intended. "You will receive everything you need to heal and grow strong. That is a promise." Harry's eyes widened, as if the concept of receiving care without payment was foreign to him. McGonagall watched as Pomfrey handed him a small vial of shimmering liquid, watched as he drank it with the desperate efficiency of someone who had learned to consume, offered food quickly before it could be taken away. As the nutrition potion began to work, bringing colour back to Harry's cheeks and easing the exhausted lines around his eyes, McGonagall made a decision that would change everything. She was going to see Dumbledore immediately. She was going to demand answers. And if those answers were not satisfactory, if they prioritized abstract, magical theory over the concrete reality of a child suffering, then she would take matters into her own hands. She had failed Harry Potter once by trusting others to protect him. She would not fail him again. "Rest now, Mr. Potter," she said, her hand briefly touching his shoulder, and noting how he still tensed under even gentle contact. "Madame Pomfrey will take excellent care of you. I have some urgent business to attend to, but I will return to check on you soon." As she left the hospital wing, the folder with Harry's class schedule forgotten on Pomfrey's desk, McGonagall's mind was already formulating the questions she would ask Dumbledore. Questions about oversight and protection. Questions about the difference between keeping a child safe and keeping a child alive. Questions about how many other students might be suffering in silence, while the adults who should protect them focused on grander, more abstract concerns. The morning light no longer seemed warm. It felt harsh, illuminating truths that had been hidden in shadows for far too long. Chapter 2. Confronting Dumbledore. McGonagall climbed the spiral staircase to the headmaster's office with measured steps that belied the fury building in her chest like steam in a cauldron. The medical file she carried felt heavier with each step, weighted with evidence of a decade's worth of systematic neglect. Behind her, she could still hear the echo of Harry's quiet voice, asking if he had done something wrong. Still see the way he had flinched from Pomfrey's gentle touch, as if kindness itself was something to fear. The gargoyle statue recognized her approach and stepped aside without requiring a password, as it did for the deputy headmistress. She took the moving staircase 2 steps at a time, her usually perfect composure fracturing with each memory that surfaced. Harry's thin wrists, the visible ribs beneath his school shirt, the way he had drunk the nutrition potion as if he feared it might be snatched away. She did not knock. The oak doors to Dumbledore's office flew open with a bang that sent Fawkes squawking from his perch and rattled the delicate silver instruments scattered across the headmaster's desk. Dumbledore looked up from the parchment he had been reading, his blue eyes widening slightly at her entrance, though his expression quickly settled into one of mild concern. "Minerva," he said gently, setting down his quill with careful precision. "You seem distressed. Perhaps you would care to sit—" "Do not," McGonagall said, her voice cutting through his placating tone like a blade through silk. "Offer me tea and sympathy when you know perfectly well why I am here." She crossed the office in 3 sharp strides and slammed the medical file down on his desk hard enough to make the ink bottle jump. Several of the silver instruments began whistling in agitation, as if sensing the tension that crackled in the air between them. "Harry Potter's medical examination has been completed," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "Would you care to guess what Madame Pomfrey discovered?" Dumbledore's fingers steepled before him, and she saw something flicker across his features, not surprise, but resignation. the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation for some time. "I imagine," he said carefully, "that the boy shows some signs of his difficult early childhood. It is not uncommon for children from troubled homes to require additional care when they arrive at Hogwarts." Troubled homes. McGonagall repeated the words with the precision of someone savouring a particularly bitter potion. "Is that what you call systematic starvation, Albus? Prolonged confinement? 6 separate healed fractures that Poppy estimates occurred before his 8th birthday?" She opened the file and began reading from Pomfrey's notes, her voice growing sharper with each clinical detail. "Chronic malnutrition, consistent with prolonged periods of insufficient caloric intake. Growth hormone deficiencies stemming from psychological stress and food restriction. Evidence of vitamin D deficiency suggesting limited exposure to sunlight. Behavioral patterns consistent with severe emotional abuse and neglect." Dumbledore's hands remained folded, but she noticed the slight tremor in his fingers, the way his gaze drifted toward the window rather than meeting her eyes. "The boy told us," McGonagall continued relentlessly, "that he lived in a cupboard under the stairs until his Hogwarts letters began arriving. A cupboard, Albus. Like a piece of unwanted furniture." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, fury and grief warring in her throat. "The blood protection," Dumbledore began, but McGonagall cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Do not speak to me of blood protection when the child nearly died from the very people meant to provide it." She leaned forward, bracing her hands on his desk. "I watched them, Albus. Do you remember? The night you left him on their doorstep like a bottle of milk, I told you what I had seen. I spent an entire day observing that family, and I told you they were the worst sort of muggles imaginable." The memory rose before her with painful clarity. Herself in cat form, crouched beneath a hedge on Privet Drive, watching Vernon Dursley kick a cat from his garden and laugh when it yowled, watching Petunia peer through her curtains at the neighbours with pinched disapproval, making sharp comments about the noise when children played in their own gardens, watching little Dudley, barely more than a toddler himself, learning to throw his toys at smaller children and seeing his parents' proud approval when he made another child cry. "They are people who value conformity above kindness," she had told Dumbledore that night. "They will see Harry's magic as something shameful to be beaten out of him." And Dumbledore had smiled that same gentle, infuriating smile, and assured her that love would find a way. "You knew," she said now, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew what they were, and you left him there anyway." "I had hopes," Dumbledore said quietly, "that Petunia would remember her sister's love, that blood would prove stronger than prejudice." "Blood." McGonagall straightened, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "Harry Potter is 11 years old and weighs less than most children of 9. His growth has been so severely stunted that he may never reach his full height. He believes that receiving care without payment is impossible, that food is something earned through good behavior rather than a basic right. What protection is that, Albus?" She opened the file again and pulled out a piece of parchment covered in Pomfrey's careful measurements and charts. "Look at this. These are the growth projections based on his parents' heights. James was nearly 6 feet tall. Lily was 5.5 feet. Harry should be showing signs of the height he will inherit. Instead, he looks like a child 2 years younger because his body has been systematically deprived of what it needs to grow." Dumbledore finally looked at the charts, and McGonagall saw his shoulders sag slightly as he took in the stark evidence of what his protection had cost. "There were reports," he admitted quietly, "over the years. Members of the Order would occasionally observe the family, and their reports were concerning. But the blood protection requires that Harry call it home. If we removed him, he would be alive and healthy and whole," McGonagall snapped, "instead of broken and half-starved and so grateful for basic kindness that it breaks your heart to watch. She thought of Harry's face when she had promised him the nutrition potions would cost nothing. The wonder in his eyes, as if the concept of receiving what he needed without paying some terrible price was entirely foreign to him. "You speak of protection as if it is an abstract, magical theory," she continued. "But protection is supposed to mean safety. It is supposed to mean that a child grows up knowing he is valued and cared for. What you gave Harry Potter was not protection. It was sacrifice. You sacrificed his childhood, his health, his sense of self-worth, all for the sake of some theoretical magical safeguard." "The prophecy," Dumbledore began again, but McGonagall's patience had finally snapped entirely. "The prophecy says nothing about the boy needing to suffer," she said, her voice rising. "It says nothing about him needing to be broken down until he believes himself worthless. You made those choices, Albus. You decided that Harry Potter's well-being was an acceptable price to pay for your grand designs." The silence that followed was thick with 10 years of unspoken guilt and recrimination. McGonagall could hear the soft ticking of the magical clocks that lined the office walls, counting away the seconds of Harry's childhood that could never be recovered. "What would you have me do?" Dumbledore asked finally, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion that spoke of a man who had been carrying impossible burdens for too long. "Remove him from the protection entirely. Risk everything we have worked for? I would have you acknowledge that protection, which requires a child's suffering, is not protection at all," McGonagall said. "I would have you admit that you have failed in your duty to that boy. And I would have you remove him from that house immediately and place him somewhere he will be truly safe. And if I refuse?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. McGonagall straightened to her full height, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of 3 decades of teaching and leadership. "Then I will do it myself." Dumbledore's blue eyes sharpened, and for a moment she saw beneath the grandfatherly facade to something harder and more calculating. "You would defy the decision of the chief warlock of the Wizengamott? Risk disrupting magical protections that have kept the boy alive for 10 years? All for your emotional attachment to one child?" "My emotional attachment," McGonagall repeated, and her voice was dangerously quiet. "Is that what you call caring, whether a child in our charge is fed and housed and treated with basic human decency? If that is emotional attachment, then yes, I am guilty of it." She gathered the medical file from his desk, her movements precise and controlled. "I will not serve under a headmaster who considers a child's well-being to be disposable for the greater good. Harry Potter deserves better than to be a pawn in your grand strategy, and he deserves better than adults who are willing to let him suffer for theoretical protections." "Minerva," Dumbledore said, rising from his chair, "you are upset. Perhaps if you took some time to consider—" "I have had 10 years to consider," she cut him off. 10 years of trusting your judgment while a child suffered. 10 years of telling myself that surely you must know something I do not. That surely there was a good reason for leaving him in that place. She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. There was no good reason, Albus. There was only your willingness to let a boy pay the price for your choices. The gargoyle statue was already moving aside for her when she reached the bottom of the staircase, as if even it could sense that the deputy headmistress who had climbed these stairs was not the same woman who was descending them. McGonagall walked through the corridors of Hogwarts with steady steps, her mind already turning to practical considerations. Legal precedents for removing children from harmful situations, contacts in the ministry who might assist her, alternatives to the blood protection that could keep Harry safe without requiring his suffering. She had spent 10 years being Dumbledore's loyal deputy, trusting his wisdom even when it conflicted with her instincts. That McGonagall had died in the hospital wing, looking down at a boy who flinched from kindness and asked if he had done something wrong simply by existing. The McGonagall who remained had only one priority: ensuring that Harry Potter never spent another day believing himself worthless, never went another night hungry, never again lived in fear of the people who should protect him. She would save him, even if it meant standing against the most powerful wizard in Britain, even if it meant walking away from the school that had been her home for decades. Some things, she had finally learned, were worth any sacrifice. Chapter 3. The Resignation. McGonagall sat at her desk in the pre-dawn darkness, a piece of parchment before her that would change everything. The words she had written and rewritten through the sleepless hours seemed insufficient for the magnitude of what she was about to do, yet they carried the weight of a decision that had been building for 10 years. To the Board of Governors of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, I hereby tender my resignation from the position of Deputy Headmistress and Professor of Transfiguration, effective at the completion of arrangements for my replacement. This decision stems from irreconcilable differences regarding child welfare policies and the systematic failure of school administration to protect students from documented abuse and neglect. When institutional loyalty conflicts with the moral obligation to safeguard children in our care, I choose the children. I will provide full documentation of my concerns to the appropriate authorities. Respectfully, Professor M. McGonagall. She set down her quill and stared at the letter that would end 39 years of service to Hogwarts. 39 years of believing that the institution she loved would always do right by its students. The betrayal of that faith felt like a physical wound, but beneath it ran something stronger. The absolute certainty that she was finally doing what should have been done a decade ago. The first light of dawn was beginning to creep through her office windows when she made copies of the resignation letter. One for the Board of Governors, one for the Ministry's Department of Education, and one for the Daily Prophet, because transparency, she had learned, was the only weapon against comfortable complicity. But resignation was only the beginning. Harry Potter needed more than her moral outrage. He needed legal protection, a safe place to live, and adults who would put his well-being above political considerations, which meant she had work to do. McGonagall rose from her desk and moved to the fireplace, throwing flue powder into the grate with practiced efficiency. The green flames roared to life, and she knelt before them, speaking clearly into the magical connection. Amelia Bones, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The flames shifted and swirled, and within moments the stern face of Amelia Bones appeared in the fire, her grey hair pulled back severely despite the early hour. Minerva? Amelia's eyebrows rose in surprise. It's barely 6 in the morning. What's happened? I need to speak with you about a child welfare case, McGonagall said, without preamble, involving Harry Potter and the systematic abuse he has suffered at the hands of his guardians. Are you available to meet this morning? The surprise on Amelia's face shifted quickly to professional concern. How serious are we talking? Serious enough that I have resigned my position at Hogwarts rather than continue to enable institutional negligence, McGonagall replied. Serious enough that if legal intervention is not taken immediately, I will be forced to take matters into my own hands. I'll be in my office within the hour, Amelia said grimly. Bring documentation. The flames died, leaving McGonagall alone with the gravity of what she had just set in motion. She gathered the medical files, her resignation letters, and the notes she had made during her confrontation with Dumbledore. Then she made another flue call, this time to Gringotts. I need to speak with the Potter account manager, she told the goblin who appeared in the flames, his sharp features creased with irritation at the early hour. Regarding Harry Potter's academic and welfare status as his head of house at Hogwarts. The goblin's expression shifted to something more calculating. Ragnarok will see you at 9 o'clock. Bring proper identification and your official school credentials. McGonagall had never before visited Gringotts in her official capacity as a student's head of house, but she knew that the position carried certain legal rights regarding the welfare of underage wizards and witches. If Harry had inherited properties or funds that could provide him with alternatives to the Dursleys, she needed to know about them. By 7:30, she was walking through the corridors of Hogwarts toward the hospital wing, her footsteps echoing in the early morning quiet. She found Poppy Pumphrey already at work, updating patient charts and preparing the day's medications. "Poppy," McGonagall said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that lives may depend on your answer. How many other students have you seen who showed signs of abuse or severe neglect?" Pumphrey looked up from her charts, her expression growing grave. "In my 30 years as school mediwitch, too many. But Minerva, you know the constraints I work under. Unless a student specifically reports abuse, or unless injuries are severe enough to warrant ministry intervention, my hands are tied by confidentiality requirements and institutional policies." "What if those institutional policies were to change?" McGonagall asked. "What if there were new protocols that required mandatory reporting of suspected abuse? What if student welfare took precedence over institutional reputation?" "Then perhaps fewer children would suffer in silence," Pumphrey said softly. "Minerva, what are you planning?" McGonagall pulled a chair close to Pumphrey's desk and sat down, leaning forward with the intensity of someone sharing state secrets. "I am planning to ensure that Harry Potter never spends another day with people who treat him as less than human, and in doing so, I hope to create a system that protects every child who walks through these doors." She outlined her morning's activities: the resignation, the meeting with Amelia Bones, the appointment at Gringotts. She watched as Pumphrey's eyes widened with understanding and something that might have been relief. "You're really going to do it," Pumphrey breathed. "You're going to stand up to Dumbledore and the entire wizarding establishment for one boy. For every boy and girl who has ever been failed by adults who were supposed to protect them," McGonagall corrected. "Harry Potter is simply the case that has finally forced me to act on what I should have done years ago. What do you need from me? Complete medical documentation of Harry's condition, not just the examination results, but your professional opinion about the long-term effects of his treatment and what he will need to recover. I also need you to think about other students who might benefit from new reporting protocols." Pumphrey nodded, her expression determined. "You'll have everything by this afternoon. And Minerva, thank you. I've been watching children suffer for too long without being able to do enough to help them." McGonagall's next stop was the greenhouse complex, where she found Professor Sprout already tending to her plants in the early morning light. Pomona Sprout had always been practical and protective of her students, qualities that McGonagall hoped would make her an ally in what was to come. "Pomona," McGonagall began, settling onto a stool beside the workbench where Sprout was repotting seedlings. "I need to tell you something that will probably shock you, and then I need to ask for your support." She related the discovery of Harry's condition and her confrontation with Dumbledore, watching as Sprout's hands stilled on the plant she was handling. The herbology professor's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, horror, anger, and finally a grim determination. "That poor boy," Sprout murmured. "All this time we thought he was just shy and small for his age. To think he was enduring that while we went about our business, assuming someone else was looking after him properly." She set down her trowel with a sharp click. "What can I do? I'm going to need character references for any legal proceedings that arise from this. I'm going to need colleagues who will speak up about the need for better child protection policies at Hogwarts, and I may need people willing to provide temporary housing for a boy who has nowhere safe to go." "You have all three," Sprout said immediately. "My cottage has a spare room, and my sister runs a children's home in Devon if more specialized care is needed. As for character references, Minerva, anyone who knows you knows that you wouldn't take a stand like this unless it was absolutely necessary." McGonagall felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. She was not alone in this fight. Her final conversation of the morning was with Phileas Flitwick, whom she found in his office preparing lessons for the day. The tiny professor listened to her account with growing dismay, his usually cheerful expression darkening as she described the medical evidence of Harry's mistreatment. "Albus knew," Flitwick asked quietly when she had finished. "He knew the boy was being abused and left him there anyway?" "He prioritized theoretical magical protection over Harry's actual well-being," McGonagall replied. "When I confronted him about it, he made it clear that he considers Harry's suffering an acceptable cost for whatever grand strategy he has in mind." Flitwick was silent for a long moment, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that reminded McGonagall that beneath his cheerful exterior lay the mind of a former dueling champion. "Count me among your allies, Minerva. If this becomes a legal battle, I will testify about what I have observed. If it becomes a political battle, I will use whatever influence my family name carries. And if it becomes a matter of finding safe alternatives for students in danger, my home is always open." By 9 o'clock, McGonagall was sitting across from Ragnok in the depths of Gringotts, watching as the goblin reviewed documents that made her anger burn even hotter. Harry Potter was not just wealthy. He was one of the richest individuals in Wizarding Britain, with properties scattered across England and Scotland, trust funds that had been growing for 11 years, and investments that generated more income in a month than most families saw in a year. "The boy has never been informed of his inheritance?" Ragnok asked, his sharp eyes studying McGonagall's face. "He believed his school supplies were expensive enough to be a burden on his relatives," McGonagall said tightly. "He asked me yesterday if he would have to pay for medical potions, because his guardians had told him Hogwarts was costly. He has been living in poverty while sitting on a fortune." "This is highly irregular," Ragnok mused. "The Potter account has specific provisions for the boy's care and education, funds that have never been accessed despite clear documentation of need. Someone has been deliberately preventing him from accessing what is rightfully his." "Could these funds and properties be used to provide him with alternative guardianship?" McGonagall asked. "Safe housing, proper care, education at Hogwarts without depending on people who abuse him." "Absolutely. The Potter estate includes several properties suitable for family living, as well as sufficient funds to provide excellent care for centuries." Ragnok leaned back in his chair. "Professor McGonagall, as the boy's head of house, you have certain rights to advocate for his welfare. If you were to petition for guardianship, these resources would be available to support that petition." McGonagall left Gringotts with copies of documents that would change Harry's life and a cold fury at the scope of Dumbledore's manipulations. Not only had he left Harry with abusive relatives, he had kept the boy ignorant of resources that could have provided him with alternatives. Every aspect of Harry's suffering had been not just preventable, but actively maintained by the man who claimed to protect him. Her meeting with Amelia Bones was scheduled for 2 o'clock, but first she had one more task. She returned to Hogwarts and made her way to the hospital wing, where she found Harry sitting up in bed, looking better than he had the day before, but still painfully thin and weary. "Mr. Potter," she said, taking a seat beside his bed, "I need to speak with you about some important matters regarding your future. But first, I want you to know that you are safe, and that there are people working to ensure you never have to return to a place where you are not wanted and cared for." Harry's eyes widened, hope and disbelief warring in their green depths. "Professor, are you saying I don't have to go back to the Dursleys?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," McGonagall replied firmly. "But I need you to understand that this may involve some legal proceedings, some meetings with adults you don't know, and possibly some changes to your living arrangements. Through all of it, I want you to remember that you have done nothing wrong, and that you deserve to be safe and happy." For the first time since she had known him, Harry Potter smiled, really smiled, with genuine joy lighting up his thin face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Professor." McGonagall felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. This was why she had become a teacher in the first place, to protect children, to help them grow and flourish. She would not fail Harry Potter again. As she left the hospital wing to prepare for her crucial meeting with Amelia Bones, McGonagall carried with her the weight of Harry's trust and the knowledge that she was about to challenge some of the most powerful people in Wizarding Britain. But she also carried the support of trusted colleagues, the resources of the Potter estate, and the unshakable conviction that some fights were worth any personal cost. The resignation letter on her desk was just the beginning. The real work of saving Harry Potter and reforming the systems that had failed him was about to begin. Chapter 4. Gathering Allies. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement felt different in the afternoon light than it had during McGonagall's morning visit. The bustle of daily business created a cover of normalcy that belied the gravity of what she was discussing with Amelia Bones across the cluttered desk of the DMLE director. "This is worse than I expected," Amelia said, setting down the medical files with the careful precision of someone handling explosive materials. "Poppy Pomfrey's documentation is thorough and damning. 6 healed fractures before age 8, chronic malnutrition, psychological conditioning consistent with severe abuse." She looked up at McGonagall with the sharp focus that had made her one of the most respected law enforcement officials in Britain. "You're certain Dumbledore was aware of this?" "He admitted as much during our confrontation," McGonagall replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. "He acknowledged receiving concerning reports from Order members over the years, but claimed the blood protection required Harry to remain with the Dursleys regardless of the cost to his well-being." Amelia leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "Minerva, I need you to understand something. This isn't the first complaint I've received about Dumbledore's handling of student welfare. Over the past 5 years, I've had 3 separate families approach me about his interference in custody disputes and his tendency to prioritize what he calls the greater good over individual safety." McGonagall felt a chill settle in her stomach. "Other students?" "A Hufflepuff whose parents were fighting for custody. Dumbledore intervened to keep the child with an abusive father because the man had useful political connections. A Ravenclaw who reported sexual assault by an older student. Dumbledore handled it internally rather than involving proper authorities, and the victim was transferred to Beauxbatons for her own comfort." Amelia's jaw tightened. A Gryffindor whose grandmother was trying to remove him from parents involved with dark arts. Dumbledore blocked the transfer because he wanted to monitor the family's activities. "My God," McGonagall whispered. "How many children has he sacrificed for his strategies?" "Too many. But Harry Potter's case might finally give us the leverage we need to force accountability. The boy who lived commands public attention in a way that makes cover-ups impossible." Amelia pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began writing. "I'm going to connect you with Lysander Scrimgeour at the Child Welfare Authority. He specializes in emergency custody transfers and has been looking for a case high-profile enough to establish stronger precedents for magical child protection." As McGonagall left the ministry with legal contacts and preliminary guardianship documents, her mind was already turning to the next phase of her plan. Harry needed more than legal protection. He needed people who understood what it meant to walk away from family obligations when those obligations became destructive. The cottage in Grimmauld Place's shadow districts had taken her an hour to locate, but the woman who answered the door was exactly what McGonagall had hoped for. Andromeda Tonks stood in her doorway, with the bearing of someone who had learned to be wary of unexpected visitors, her greying hair pulled back and her wand held loosely at her side. "Professor McGonagall?" Andromeda's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I wasn't expecting. Is everything all right?" "Mrs. Tonks, I need to speak with you about a matter that requires both discretion and courage," McGonagall said. "It concerns a child who needs protection from family members who are supposed to care for him." Something shifted in Andromeda's expression, recognition, perhaps, of a situation she understood too well. "Please come in." The cottage's interior was warm and lived in, with evidence of family life scattered throughout. Children's drawings on the refrigerator, a pile of aura training manuals on the coffee table, photographs of a young woman with bright pink hair, laughing at something off camera. "Tea?" Andromeda offered, already moving toward the kitchen. "And please call me Andromeda. Anyone who works with my Nymphadora gets first-name privileges." As they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, McGonagall outlined Harry's situation with the careful precision of someone presenting a legal case. She watched as Andromeda's expression moved through recognition, anger, and finally a deep, weary sadness. "I know something about choosing between family loyalty and doing what's right," Andromeda said quietly, when McGonagall had finished. "I know what it costs to stand up to people who claim blood gives them the right to hurt you. If that boy needs a safe place to stay while legal proceedings unfold, he has one here. You would do that for a child you've never met. I would do that for any child being failed by the adults who should protect them." Andromeda's voice carried the authority of personal experience. "My daughter is training to be an aura because she wants to protect people who can't protect themselves. I raised her with that value because I learned, too late, what happens when good people don't act." McGonagall felt another piece of her support network click into place. "There may be political pressure, attempts to discredit anyone who supports Harry's removal from his current guardians." "Let them try," Andromeda said with a smile that reminded McGonagall why the Black family had once been feared as well as respected. "I survived being disowned by my birth family for marrying a Muggle-born. I think I can handle whatever Dumbledore's supporters might attempt." The next morning brought McGonagall's first opportunity to observe Harry in the classroom environment, and what she saw confirmed every terrible suspicion she had developed. During his transfiguration lesson, Harry sat in the front row with the kind of perfect posture that spoke of punishment for slouching, his hands folded precisely on his desk, his attention focused with the intensity of someone who had learned that inattention brought consequences. When she handed back the practice exercises, Harry's whispered "thank you" carried the same weight of surprised gratitude she had noticed in the hospital wing. When another student dropped their quill and Harry immediately bent to retrieve it, she saw the automatic helpfulness of someone who had been trained to make himself useful to avoid being seen as a burden. But it was lunch that revealed the extent of Harry's conditioning. McGonagall watched from the head table as Harry took smaller portions than the other first years, eating with mechanical efficiency while keeping one eye on the food remaining on the platters. When a second-year Hufflepuff reached across him for the bread basket, Harry immediately pushed his own roll toward the older student, and gesture so automatic it was clear he had never considered that he might be entitled to keep his food for himself. "He hoards," Pumphrey murmured from beside her. "I've noticed it in the hospital wing. Any food I give him, he tries to save half for later. When I asked him why, he said he wanted to make sure it would last until the next time he was allowed to eat." McGonagall felt her appetite disappear entirely. She made careful notes in the small journal she had begun carrying. Subject demonstrates conditioned scarcity responses around food. Automatic deference to authority figures suggests punishment-based training. Hypervigilance, consistent with chronic stress response. Her conversation with Hagrid that afternoon proved both enlightening and heartbreaking. She found the Keeper of Keys and Grounds in his hut, preparing lessons for his Care of Magical Creatures class with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was avoiding thinking about something else. "Hagrid," McGonagall began gently, "I need to ask you about Harry Potter." The half-giant's massive hands stilled on the papers he was sorting. "What about Harry? He's a good lad. Quiet, but good. Reminds me of his father, he does. What do you know about his life with the Dursleys?" Hagrid's face went through a series of expressions before settling into something that looked like guilt mixed with defensive loyalty. "Dumbledore said they'd be good to him. Said family was important, that Harry needed normal folks to keep him grounded. But you've seen him, Hagrid. You brought him his Hogwarts letter. What did you observe?" "He was—" Hagrid struggled with the words, his accent thickening with emotion. "He was so small, Professor. And when I told him he was a wizard, He looked like I'd given him the world. Said he always knew he was different, but the Dursleys told him he was just a freak. McGonagall waited, sensing there was more. The house, Hagrid continued reluctantly. It was clean as a pin, but cold. No pictures of Harry anywhere, though there were dozens of their boy Dudley. And when Harry went to pack, he fit everything he owned in an old-school bag. Everything, Professor. 11 years of life in one small bag. Did you report these observations to Professor Dumbledore? I tried, Hagrid said miserably. But he said Harry was safer being humble, that growing up normal would keep him from getting a big head. He said the Dursleys might not be warm, but they'd keep him alive, and unknown, until he was old enough for Hogwarts. McGonagall made more notes. Witness confirms minimal personal possessions, emotional neglect, deliberate suppression of magical identity. Authority figure dismissed concerns in favor of theoretical protection. That evening brought news that McGonagall had been both expecting and dreading. An emergency owl from the Board of Governors summoned her to a meeting the following morning to discuss her precipitous resignation and the serious allegations contained therein. She spent the night preparing her presentation with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that she would have only one chance to make her case. Medical documents, witness statements, legal precedents for removing children from harmful environments, documentation of Harry's inheritance that proved alternative arrangements were financially viable. As she organized the evidence that would either save Harry Potter or destroy her career, McGonagall reflected on how much had changed in just 4 days. She had gone from being a loyal deputy headmistress to someone preparing to wage war against the most powerful wizard in Britain. The transformation should have been frightening, but instead she felt a clarity of purpose that had been missing from her life for years. Harry Potter was not just a case to be won or lost. He was a child who had been failed by every system that should have protected him, a boy who said thank you for basic kindness, because he had been taught that care was a privilege to be earned rather than a right to be expected. If she had to stand against Dumbledore, the Board of Governors, and the entire wizarding establishment to give him the safety and love he deserved, then that was exactly what she would do. The meeting tomorrow would determine whether her small network of allies was strong enough to challenge institutional power. But regardless of the outcome, McGonagall knew she could never again be the woman who had trusted others to protect the vulnerable while she focused on administrative duties. Some transformations, she had learned, were irreversible, and some fights were worth any personal cost. As she sealed her evidence into a protective portfolio, McGonagall allowed herself a moment of hope. Perhaps Harry Potter's suffering would finally force the wizarding world to confront how many children they had been willing to sacrifice for the comfort of not looking too closely. Perhaps his case would create protections that would prevent future abuse. Or perhaps she would be dismissed as an emotional woman who had lost her perspective over one traumatized boy. Either way, she would not stop fighting for him. She had made him a promise, and Minerva McGonagall didn't break her word. Chapter 5. The Taking, October 15th, 1991. McGonagall stood at her office window, watching the carriages depart for Hogsmeade Station, carrying most of the student body home for the October break. 6 weeks of careful preparation had led to this moment. 6 weeks of legal filings, character witnesses, evidence gathering, and the slow, methodical construction of a case that even Dumbledore's considerable political influence could not dismantle. Harry Potter was not among the students heading home. He sat in the hospital wing under Pumphrey's watchful eye, officially recovering from a minor case of magical exhaustion, but actually waiting for McGonagall to explain why she had asked him to remain at school during the break. The boy had accepted her request without question, as she had known he would. After 6 weeks of watching his interactions with staff and students, she had confirmed that Harry's default response to adult authority was compliance born of years of conditioning. The soft knock at her office door came precisely at 2 o'clock, as scheduled. "Come in, Amelia." Director Bones entered with the brisk efficiency that had made her legendary within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, followed by two auras whose presence transformed McGonagall's comfortable academic office into something far more official. The legal documents they carried represented the culmination of everything McGonagall had worked toward since that terrible morning in the hospital wing when she had first seen the evidence of Harry's suffering. "The emergency custody order has been approved by the full Wizengamott," Amelia announced without preamble, setting a formal scroll on McGonagall's desk. "Based on documented evidence of systematic abuse, neglect, and willful endangerment by current guardians, custody of Harry James Potter is hereby transferred to Professor Minerva McGonagall, with full legal authority to determine his residence, education, and welfare." McGonagall felt a moment of pure relief, so intense it left her momentarily lightheaded. And Dumbledore's objections? Overruled. The Wizengamott was unusually focused after reviewing Madame Pumphrey's medical testimony and your documentation of the boy's living conditions. Amelia's expression was grim but satisfied. 3 members of the court have children who attended Hogwarts. Hearing that a student had been living in a cupboard while the headmaster knew about it did not sit well with them. "He'll try to prevent us from removing Harry." "Let him try." Amelia gestured to the auras flanking her. "This is a legal custody transfer, backed by the full authority of wizarding law. If Professor Dumbledore wishes to obstruct it, he'll find himself facing charges of interfering with child welfare proceedings." They found Dumbledore waiting for them in the corridor outside the hospital wing, his usually benevolent expression tempered with something harder and more calculating. He did not appear surprised to see them, which told McGonagall that her weeks of careful preparation had not gone unnoticed. "Albus," she said coolly, stopping before the hospital wing doors. "We need to speak with Harry Potter." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Dumbledore replied, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had swayed countless political decisions over the decades. "Young Harry is still recovering from his recent magical exhaustion and should not be disturbed. Perhaps we could discuss whatever concerns you have in my office instead." "There's nothing to discuss," Amelia said, producing the custody documents with the flourish of someone who had been looking forward to this moment. "Professor McGonagall has been granted emergency guardianship of Harry Potter by order of the Wizengamott. We're here to execute that order." Dumbledore's eyes moved to the parchment, and McGonagall saw the moment when he realized the scope of what she had accomplished. The surprise that flickered across his features was quickly replaced by something that looked disturbingly like calculation. "I see," he said quietly. "And may I ask on what grounds the Wizengamott has seen fit to overturn guardianship arrangements that have protected the boy for 11 years? "On the grounds that protection, which requires a child's systematic abuse, is not protection at all," McGonagall said, her voice carrying 6 weeks' worth of suppressed anger. "On the grounds that Harry Potter deserves better than to be sacrificed for your abstract theories about blood magic and the greater good. The blood protection is irrelevant if the boy dies from neglect before he's old enough to face whatever threats you're protecting him from," Amelia interrupted sharply. "Professor Dumbledore, you can either step aside and allow us to execute this legal order, or you can explain to a room full of auras why you believe your personal theories supersede the established law of magical Britain." For a long moment, McGonagall thought Dumbledore might actually try to prevent them from entering the hospital wing. She could see the conflict playing out behind his ancient blue eyes, political calculation warring with what might have been genuine concern for Harry's welfare, though she was no longer certain she could tell the difference. Finally, he stepped aside with a slight bow that somehow managed to convey both acquiescence and disapproval. "I trust you understand the magnitude of what you're doing," he said quietly, as McGonagall moved past him toward the hospital wing doors. "There are protections in place that you do not fully comprehend, consequences that may not become apparent until it is too late to reverse them." "The only thing I understand," McGonagall replied without looking back, "is that a child's immediate safety matters more than theoretical future threats. Harry was sitting up in his hospital bed when they entered, his green eyes moving quickly between the group of adults with the wariness of someone who had learned to assess potential danger in any gathering of authority figures. McGonagall felt her heart clench at the automatic tension in his small frame, the way his hands gripped the bedsheets as if preparing to defend himself. "Harry," she said gently, crossing to his bedside with the careful movement she might use to approach a frightened animal. "I need to speak with you about some important changes that are going to happen. But first, I want you to know that you are not in trouble, and that everything we're about to discuss is meant to keep you safe. Professor?" Harry's voice was barely above a whisper, his gaze flicking to the auras and back to her face. "Have I done something wrong? Are they taking me back to the Dursleys?" The fear in his voice nearly broke her professional composure. 6 weeks of proper nutrition and care at Hogwarts had helped Harry physically. He was still small for his age, but no longer appeared malnourished. But the psychological damage ran deeper than any healing potion could reach. "No, Harry," she said firmly, sitting down in the chair beside his bed. "You are never going back to the Dursleys. These people are here to make sure of that." She watched as confusion replaced fear in his expression, as if the concept of adults working to protect him rather than control him was still foreign enough to be incomprehensible. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "If I'm not in trouble, and I'm not going back to Privet Drive, then where?" "You're going to come home with me," McGonagall said, and felt her own surprise at how naturally the word home had emerged. "I have a cottage in the Scottish Highlands, where you'll be safe and cared for. You'll continue your education at Hogwarts, of course, but when school isn't in session, you'll have a real home with people who want you there." Harry stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions too complex for an 11-year-old to be carrying. Disbelief, hope, fear, and something that might have been grief for the childhood he had never been allowed to have. "You want me?" he asked, his voice so quiet she had to lean closer to hear him. "Even though I'm not normal? Even though I'm just Harry?" McGonagall felt something break inside her chest. "Harry Potter," she said firmly, "you are not just anything. You are a brave, kind, intelligent boy who deserves to be loved and protected and valued for exactly who you are. And yes, I want you. Very much." The tears that spilled down Harry's cheeks were silent, as if even his crying had been trained to be unobtrusive. McGonagall reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away if he needed to, and gently squeezed his hand. "Can we go now?" he whispered. "Please? Can we go now?" "Right now," she promised. The journey to her cottage was accomplished by Portkey, the magical transportation landing them in the garden of a stone house nestled between rolling hills and ancient forests. McGonagall had spent the last 3 weeks preparing the space, warding it with protections that would make it unplottable to anyone who meant Harry harm, stocking it with food and books and everything an 11-year-old boy might need to feel secure. Harry stood in the garden for a long moment, turning slowly to take in the peaceful landscape that stretched in all directions. There were no neighbors close enough to peer through windows, no cramped suburban streets where appearances mattered more than kindness. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice carrying wonder instead of fear for the first time since McGonagall had known him. "It's yours," she replied, "for as long as you want it to be." She gave him the tour slowly, watching his reactions to each room. The kitchen with its warm hearth and well-stocked pantry made him pause, his eyes widening as he took in the abundance of food that would be available to him whenever he was hungry. The sitting room with its comfortable chairs and shelves full of books earned a small smile. But it was the bedroom she had prepared for him that finally broke through his careful composure. It was not a large room, but it was clearly designed for a child's comfort and happiness. The bed was sized for an 11-year-old, rather than the cramped cot he had slept on at Hogwarts, covered with soft blankets in deep blue and green. There was a desk for homework and a bookshelf already filled with stories appropriate for his age. The windows looked out over the garden, and she had hung curtains that could be drawn for complete privacy. "This is mine?" Harry asked, standing in the doorway as if he were afraid to enter without permission. "Completely yours," McGonagall confirmed. "You can arrange it however you like, decorate it however makes you comfortable. These are your things, in your room, in your home." Harry moved into the room like he was walking into a dream, running his fingers over the soft bedding and touching the spine of books that belonged to him. When he turned back to her, his expression was radiant with something she had never seen on his face before. Pure, uncomplicated joy. "Thank you," he said, and his voice carried none of the automatic gratitude she had grown used to hearing from him. This was different. Genuine happiness, freely given. "Thank you, Professor McGonagall." "Minerva," she corrected gently. "When we're here, when it's just us, you can call me Minerva. Or—" She hesitated, then forged ahead with something she had been thinking about for weeks. "If you'd like, and only if you'd like, you could call me Aunt Minerva." Harry's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the silent, practiced tears she had seen at Hogwarts. These were the tears of a child who had finally been offered what he had never dared to hope for. Unconditional love, freely given, with no price attached. "Aunt Minerva," he whispered, testing the words like they were precious things that might break if handled too roughly. That night, as McGonagall sat by the fireplace reviewing the legal documents that had made Harry's rescue possible, she could hear him moving around in his room, opening and closing drawers, arranging his few possessions in the space that was finally, completely his own. The sounds were different from anything she had heard in decades of supervising dormitories. These were the sounds of a child who was home. She had saved Harry Potter from a situation that would have continued to damage him in ways both visible and hidden. But as she listened to his quiet movements above her, McGonagall realized that perhaps he had saved her as well. From a life of comfortable complicity, from the belief that other people's decisions about right and wrong could substitute for her own moral courage. The news of Harry's removal from the Dursleys would spread through magical Britain by morning, bringing challenges and confrontations that she wasn't yet prepared for. But tonight, for the first time in 11 years, Harry Potter was sleeping safely in a place where he was wanted and valued and loved. That, McGonagall decided, was worth any storm that might follow. Chapter 6. Legal Battles. The formal hearing room in the Ministry of Magic had never seen a case quite like Harry Potter's custody battle. McGonagall sat at the petitioner's table, her hands folded calmly over the stack of evidence that had taken weeks to compile, while across the chamber, Dumbledore maintained his typical bearing of serene authority, despite the severity of the charges against his judgment. Between them, the 9 members of the Wizengamott's family court division prepared to hear testimony that would determine not only Harry's future, but the precedent for child protection throughout magical Britain. Harry himself was not required to attend the preliminary hearings, for which McGonagall was deeply grateful. 3 weeks in her cottage had begun the slow work of helping him understand that he deserved care and kindness, but the fragile progress they had made would not benefit from exposure to a courtroom full of adults debating his worth. The court recognizes Chief Warlock Dumbledore's emergency petition to reverse the custody order granted to Professor McGonagall, announced Madame Marchbanks, her ancient voice carrying clearly through the chamber. The respondent claims that removal of Mr. Potter from his designated guardians has compromised essential magical protections and endangers both the child and the wizarding community. Professor McGonagall, how do you respond to these claims? McGonagall rose with the measured dignity of someone who had spent decades commanding respect through competence rather than political maneuvering. I respond, Madame Marchbanks, that magical protection, which requires a child's systematic abuse, is not protection at all. I present to this court documented evidence that Mr. Potter suffered severe neglect and abuse while under Professor Dumbledore's placement, and that this suffering was known to and dismissed by the very person now claiming concern for the child's welfare. The first witness called was Madame Pomfrey, whose medical testimony carried the weight of 3 decades of treating children at Hogwarts. McGonagall watched as the Mediwitch presented her findings with clinical precision, her professional demeanour barely containing the fury that had been building since she first examined Harry's condition. The patient presented with chronic malnutrition, consistent with prolonged food restriction, Pomfrey stated, referring to her notes. Growth stunting, suggesting years of inadequate nutrition and psychological stress. Evidence of at least 6 separate healed fractures, some dating to early childhood. Vitamin deficiencies indicating limited exposure to sunlight. Behavioral responses consistent with severe emotional abuse and systematic conditioning. In your professional opinion, asked the court advocate, what would have been the long-term effects if Mr. Potter had remained in his previous environment? Pomfrey's voice was steady, but McGonagall could see her hands trembling slightly as she responded. Permanent growth stunting. Continued psychological damage that would likely have affected his ability to form healthy relationships. Possible learning disabilities due to chronic stress and malnutrition. In my opinion, another few years in that environment would have caused irreversible harm to both his physical and mental development. Dumbledore's cross-examination focused on the blood protection, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had swayed countless political decisions. Madame Pomfrey, while I do not dispute your medical findings, surely you understand that some temporary hardship might be justified if it preserved Mr. Potter's life against far greater threats. Temporary. Pomfrey's professional composure cracked slightly. Professor Dumbledore, this child lived in a cupboard for 11 years. He was systematically starved, isolated, and psychologically conditioned to believe himself worthless. What part of that constitutes temporary hardship? The next witness surprised even McGonagall. Molly Weasley approached the witness stand with the determined waddle of a woman who had spent weeks wrestling with her conscience and finally chosen courage over comfort. Her testimony was halting at first, punctuated by tears and self-recrimination. I saw him at King's Cross, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. So small and lost, trying to find platform 9 3/4. When I helped him, I noticed how thin he was, how grateful he seemed for basic kindness. But I thought, her voice broke, I thought surely someone else was looking after him properly. Surely Professor Dumbledore had arrangements in place. Did you report your concerns about Mr. Potter's condition to any authority? The advocate pressed gently. No, Molly whispered. I should have. I should have followed my instincts and made sure someone was protecting that boy. Instead, I assumed others knew better than I did. She looked directly at Dumbledore, her usual deference replaced by maternal fury. I have 7 children, Professor. I know what a properly cared-for child looks like, and Harry Potter was not it. The revelation that Dudley Dursley's school records had been subpoenaed sent a ripple of interest through the courtroom. The Muggle documentation painted a picture that corroborated every concern McGonagall had raised, reports of bullying behaviour that specifically targeted a student identified only as D. Dursley's cousin, noting that the victim was frequently seen with inadequate clothing in cold weather and appeared to receive no lunch money despite the family's obvious affluence. Mrs. Arabella Figg's testimony provided the most damning evidence yet. The squib neighbour had spent years observing the Dursley household from her position across the street, documenting incidents that she had dutifully reported to order contacts, who apparently never acted on her concerns. I saw the boy locked outside the house on multiple occasions, she testified, her voice shaking with years of suppressed anger. Sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. I saw him forced to tend the garden while his cousin and friends threw things at him. I saw him begging at neighbours' doors for food when the Dursleys went on holiday and left him behind. She turned toward Dumbledore with an expression of betrayal that cut deeper than any legal argument. I reported all of this. Every incident, every concern. I was told that my job was to observe, not to intervene, because the protection was worth more than the boy's comfort. And you accepted this explanation? The advocate asked. To my eternal shame, yes. I trusted that wiser people than I understood what was best for Harry Potter. I was wrong. McGonagall felt the mood in the courtroom shift as each testimony built upon the last, creating an overwhelming picture of institutional failure and willful blindness. Even the Wizengamott members, who had initially seemed sympathetic to Dumbledore's position, were beginning to look uncomfortable with the scope of what had been allowed to continue. When Dumbledore took the stand in his own defense, his testimony was a masterclass in political rhetoric that nonetheless could not escape the weight of evidence arrayed against him. I do not dispute that young Harry's circumstances were challenging, he admitted, his blue eyes carrying what might have been genuine regret. However, the protections afforded by his placement with blood relatives were not merely theoretical. They have kept him alive and hidden from those who would do him far greater harm than neglectful guardians ever could. Professor Dumbledore, the chief advocate pressed, you admit that you were aware of the abuse this child was suffering? I was aware that his relatives were not ideal caregivers, Dumbledore replied carefully. I had hoped that blood ties and Petunia's memory of her sister's love would overcome their initial reluctance to care for him properly. For 11 years. You maintained this hope for 11 years while receiving regular reports of escalating abuse? For the first time, Dumbledore's composure wavered slightly. I believed that the protection was worth the cost. I believed that Harry's ultimate safety required this sacrifice. And now? Do you still believe that systematic abuse was a necessary sacrifice for theoretical protection? The silence that followed was damning in itself. When Dumbledore finally answered, his voice carried the weight of a man who had finally been forced to confront the full consequences of his choices. I believed I was acting in Harry's best interests. I may have been mistaken about the extent of what those best interests required. The formal hearing concluded with a decision that surprised no one who had followed the testimony. McGonagall's custody was confirmed and expanded to include full guardianship rights, while Dumbledore was formally censured for failure to provide adequate oversight of student welfare. More significantly, the court ordered a comprehensive inquiry into Hogwarts' child protection policies and established new mandatory reporting requirements for suspected abuse. But the real victory, McGonagall knew, was not in the legal ruling. It was in the headlines that appeared across magical Britain the next morning, broadcasting Harry's story to a community that had spent 11 years assuming their hero was safe and loved. The public outrage was swift and comprehensive, with letters flooding the ministry demanding accountability for every adult who had known about Harry's situation and failed to act. That evening, McGonagall returned to her cottage to find Harry in the sitting room, surrounded by the care packages that had begun arriving from strangers across Britain. Toys, books, sweets, and letters from families offering support filled nearly every surface of the room. Aunt Minerva. Harry looked up from a letter he was reading, his expression puzzled. Mrs. Longbottom says she's sorry she didn't know to help me sooner. But I don't understand why she thinks she should have helped. She didn't even know me. McGonagall sat down beside him, choosing her words carefully. Harry, when people care about children, all children, not just their own, they feel responsible for making sure those children are safe and loved. Many people are realizing that they should have asked more questions, should have made sure you were being properly cared for. So it wasn't my fault? Harry asked quietly. That the Dursleys didn't want me? That they locked me in the cupboard and forgot to feed me sometimes? It was never your fault, McGonagall said firmly, pulling him into a gentle hug that he no longer flinched away from. Not any of it. You were a child who deserved love and care, and the adults who should have protected you failed in their duty. But that failure was theirs, never yours. Harry was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the careful consideration of someone who was still learning to trust that kindness was not a trap. "The mind healer lady," he said finally, referring to the child trauma specialist who had been working with him twice weekly since his arrival at the cottage. "She says that sometimes it takes a long time to understand that you deserve good things, that brains can learn wrong lessons when bad things happen." "Healer Morrison is very wise," McGonagall agreed, "and she's right that learning to believe you deserve happiness can take time. But you're already making progress, and you have all the time you need." As Harry returned to reading his letters of support, McGonagall reflected on how much had changed since that terrible morning in the hospital wing when she first saw the evidence of his suffering. The legal victory was satisfying, but the real triumph was sitting beside her in the form of a boy who was beginning to believe that he might deserve the love he was finally receiving. The battle for Harry's legal custody was over. The longer battle to help him heal from 11 years of abuse was just beginning. But as McGonagall watched him carefully reading each letter of support, she felt confident that both battles could be won with patience, love, and the unwavering commitment to put his well-being above all other considerations. Outside their cottage, the wizarding world was beginning to grapple with uncomfortable questions about how many other children might be suffering in silence, while adults focused on grander concerns. Inside, a formerly abused boy was learning that he was worthy of protection, care, and love. Some victories, McGonagall had learned, were worth any political cost. Chapter 7. Harry's Recovery. December 1991. McGonagall stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching Harry carefully measure flour for the biscuits they were making together. 3 months of proper nutrition and care had worked small miracles. His face had filled out enough to lose the gaunt hollows that had made him look perpetually ill, and he had grown nearly 2 inches as his body finally received what it needed to develop properly. But the changes that mattered most were harder to quantify. The way he no longer flinched when she moved suddenly, the gradual replacement of his automatic apologies with genuine questions and observations. "Is this enough flour, Aunt Minerva?" Harry asked, holding up the measuring cup for her inspection. His voice carried none of the anxiety that had once accompanied every request for approval, just the natural uncertainty of someone learning a new skill. "Perfect," she replied, moving to stand beside him at the counter. "Now we add the butter and work it in with our fingers. Like this." Cooking had become one of their most successful therapeutic activities. Healer Morrison had suggested it as a way to help Harry develop a healthy relationship with food, while learning practical life skills that the Dursleys had never bothered to teach him. McGonagall had initially worried that the kitchen might trigger memories of enforced labor at Privet Drive, but instead it had become a place where Harry seemed most at peace, perhaps because here, unlike at the Dursleys, his help was welcomed rather than demanded, and the results of his efforts were shared rather than forbidden to him. "Tell me about your session with Healer Morrison yesterday," McGonagall said gently as they worked the dough together. "Only if you want to, of course." Harry was quiet for a moment, his small hands working the butter into the flour with the careful attention he brought to everything he was still learning to trust. "She asked me when I stopped saying sorry all the time. I hadn't noticed that I stopped. But she's right. I used to apologize for everything. Breathing too loud, taking up space, existing." He looked up at her with the serious expression that sometimes made him seem older than his 12 years. "She says that's progress." "What do you think?" "I think," Harry said slowly, "that I'm starting to understand that I don't have to earn the right to be here. That you want me here just because I'm me, not because I'm useful or because I don't cause trouble." McGonagall felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied these moments of recognition, glimpses of the remarkable boy Harry was becoming as he shed the survival mechanisms that had kept him alive but prevented him from truly living. "You're absolutely right," she said, resisting the urge to hug him while his hands were covered in flour. and I'm proud of you for recognizing that change in yourself." The transformation had not been without setbacks. In November, Harry had spent 3 days barely eating after accidentally breaking one of McGonagall's teacups, convinced that his clumsiness would result in punishment or banishment. It had taken patient reassurance and several conversations with Healer Morrison to help him understand that accidents were normal parts of life, not failures deserving retribution. But December had brought breakthrough after breakthrough. Harry had begun expressing preferences about food, about books, about how to spend his time. He had started asking questions about magic that went beyond the basic curriculum, driven by genuine curiosity rather than fear of falling behind. Most remarkably, he had begun to laugh. Not the careful, quiet sounds he made when he thought laughter was expected of him, but real, spontaneous joy at things he found genuinely amusing. "Aunt Minerva," Harry said as they shaped the biscuit dough, "Healer Morrison wants to talk to both of us next week about something called inheritance counseling. She says it's time for me to understand what my parents left me." His voice carried a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "She says you already know about it." McGonagall nodded, having been dreading and anticipating this conversation for weeks. "Yes, Harry. Your parents left you quite a lot more than just money. They left you choices about where to live, how to be educated, what kind of life you want to build. But we wanted to wait until you felt secure enough to handle that information without being overwhelmed by it. Am I secure enough now?" She studied his face, still thin, but no longer pinched with constant worry. Still serious, but no longer carrying the hypervigilance of someone expecting attack at any moment. "I think you might be. But the decision about whether you're ready is yours to make." "I'd like to know," Harry said quietly. "I'd like to understand what my parents wanted for me." That afternoon found them in McGonagall's sitting room, with documents spread across the coffee table, and Harry staring in stunned silence at the list of properties, investments, and trust funds that comprised his inheritance. The numbers were meaningless to him. He had no context for understanding the difference between 1,000 galleons and 100,000, but the list of properties captured his imagination in a way that pure wealth couldn't. "Potter Manor in Godric's Hollow," he read aloud. "But I thought. Aunt Petunia said my parents were freaks who got themselves killed because they couldn't fit into normal society." "Your parents," McGonagall said carefully, "were highly respected members of the wizarding community. Your father came from an old family with significant holdings, and your mother was regarded as one of the most brilliant witches of her generation. They died fighting against someone who wanted to harm you and many other innocent people. There was nothing shameful about their lives or their deaths." She watched as Harry absorbed this information, his green eyes moving between the legal documents and her face, as if trying to reconcile this new version of his history with everything he had been taught to believe. "The Dursleys lied to me," he said finally, and his voice carried hurt rather than anger. "About everything. About who my parents were, about why they died, about whether anyone would ever want me." "Yes," McGonagall replied simply. "They lied to you about all of those things." "But why? Why would they want me to think I was worthless?" It was a question that McGonagall had been preparing to answer for months, working with Healer Morrison to find words that would help Harry understand without damaging the fragile self-worth he was building. "Some people," she said carefully, "feel better about themselves when they can make others feel small. The Dursleys were frightened of magic and jealous of things they couldn't understand. Making you feel ashamed of who you were helped them feel superior." She reached over and took his hand. "But their fear and jealousy had nothing to do with your actual worth. They were wrong about everything that mattered." December 20th brought Harry's first real Christmas, not the exercise in exclusion and resentment that had marked his previous holidays, but a celebration built around love and thoughtfulness. McGonagall had spent weeks planning carefully, working with Healer Morrison to ensure that the abundance wouldn't trigger anxiety or guilt in a boy who was still learning that he deserved good things. Harry's reaction to the gifts wrapped beneath the tree nearly undid her composure entirely. He approached them with the reverence of someone visiting a museum, touching the bright paper and ribbons as if they might disappear if handled too roughly. "These are all for me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All for you," McGonagall confirmed, "from people who care about you." The gifts themselves had been chosen with careful attention to Harry's emerging interests and needs. Books about magical theory that went beyond his textbooks, art supplies for the drawing talent he had begun to explore, warm clothes that fit properly and reflected his personal taste rather than hand-me-downs from his cousin. But the gift that moved him to tears was the simplest. A photograph album filled with pictures of his parents that Hagrid had collected over the years, showing James and Lily as the young, happy couple they had been, rather than the tragic figures of official histories. "They look so normal," Harry said, running his fingers over a photograph of his parents at what appeared to be a casual gathering with friends. "So young and happy. Not like heroes or freaks, just like people." "That's exactly what they were," McGonagall replied. "People who loved each other, loved you, and wanted you to grow up safe and happy. They would be so proud of how brave you've been, how hard you've worked to heal from everything that was done to you." By January 1992, letters began arriving from Harry's classmates at Hogwarts. The first few made him anxious. He worried that his removal from school reflected poorly on him somehow, that his friends would think less of him for needing rescue. But as McGonagall read the letters with him, it became clear that his classmates' primary concern was whether he was safe and happy. "Dear Harry," wrote Hermione Granger in her careful script, "Ron and I have been worried about you since Professor McGonagall explained that you needed to leave school for your health. We hope you're feeling better, and that you know we miss having you in our classes. Professor Flitwick says you're getting tutoring to keep up with coursework. If you need help with anything, we could send notes or study guides. Neville says to tell you that his grandmother thinks you're very brave. We hope to see you soon." "They don't think I'm broken," Harry said with wonder, rereading the letter for the third time. "They think I'm brave." "Because you are brave," McGonagall replied. "It takes tremendous courage to accept help when you've been taught to expect harm. It takes courage to learn new ways of thinking about yourself. Your friends recognize that strength in you." The question of Harry's education had been weighing on both of them as the spring term approached. Legally, Harry could return to Hogwarts whenever he felt ready, but McGonagall wanted the decision to be entirely his own, free from pressure or expectation. "I want to go back," Harry said one evening as they discussed his options. "Not because I think I should, but because I want to see my friends and learn magic properly. But I want to know that I can come home here if I need to, that this place will still be mine." "This will always be your home," McGonagall assured him, "for as long as you want it to be. And if you ever feel unsafe or unhappy at Hogwarts, you can come back immediately. No questions asked, no explanations required." As February arrived with news that Dumbledore had been replaced as headmaster by Professor McGonagall herself, a development that required her to balance her time between Hogwarts and the cottage, Harry's recovery had progressed to a point that Healer Morrison described as remarkably stable for someone with his history of trauma. He's learned to trust that care is genuine rather than conditional, the mind healer explained during one of her consultations with McGonagall. He's developing healthy boundaries and self-advocacy skills. Most importantly, he's beginning to understand his own worth as separate from his utility to others. The boy who would return to Hogwarts in March bore little resemblance to the frightened, half-starved child McGonagall had rescued in October. Harry had grown 4 inches and gained nearly 2 stone of healthy weight. His magical abilities, no longer suppressed by chronic stress and malnutrition, had begun manifesting in ways that suggested he might indeed have inherited his parents' considerable talents. But the changes that mattered most were invisible. The confidence in his voice when he expressed opinions, the way he claimed space rather than apologizing for occupying it, the genuine smile that had replaced his careful, practiced expressions of gratitude. "I'm not the same person I was," Harry said one evening as they prepared for his return to school. "The person the Dursleys created, that scared, apologetic boy who thought he deserved nothing, he's gone. I'm someone different now." "You're who you always were underneath," McGonagall corrected gently. "You're Harry Potter as he was meant to be, without the damage that was done to him. You're becoming the person your parents hoped you would grow up to be." As McGonagall watched Harry pack his trunk for his return to Hogwarts, carefully folding clothes that fit him properly, packing books he had chosen himself, including the photograph album that had become his most treasured possession, she reflected on how much they had both changed over the past months. She had begun as a teacher trying to rescue a student. She had become something she had never expected to be, a mother in every way that mattered except biology. And Harry had transformed from a victim of abuse into a confident young man who understood his own worth and could accept love without fearing the cost. The work of healing was never truly finished, McGonagall knew. Harry would probably always carry some scars from his early years, would probably always need to actively choose trust over suspicion, love over fear. But as she watched him prepare to rejoin the world with confidence and hope, she felt certain that the foundation they had built together was strong enough to support whatever challenges lay ahead. Some rescues, she had learned, became transformations. Some acts of courage rippled outward to change not just one life, but the understanding of what love and protection should mean for every child fortunate enough to receive them. Chapter 8. The Wizengamott Trial. March 1992. The full Wizengamott had not convened for a case involving child welfare in over 50 years, but the Harry Potter custody scandal had forced the magical government's highest court into emergency session. McGonagall sat in the witness chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap as she faced the semicircle of purple-robed judges whose decision would determine not only the final resolution of Harry's case, but the precedent for child protection throughout magical Britain. Behind the defendant's barrier, Dumbledore maintained his characteristic bearing of serene dignity, though McGonagall noticed the subtle signs of strain around his eyes that spoke of a man whose carefully constructed political edifice was crumbling around him. The charges against him were unprecedented: willful endangerment of a minor, abuse of educational authority, and obstruction of child welfare investigations. "Professor McGonagall," Chief Warlock Bagnold began, her voice carrying clearly through the ancient chamber, "you stand before this court not as an accuser, but as a guardian seeking permanent legal recognition of your custody of Harry Potter. Please tell the Wizengamott why you believe such recognition is necessary." McGonagall rose with the measured dignity of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. "Chief Warlock, I stand before this court because a child in our care was systematically abused for 11 years, while the adults responsible for his protection chose political convenience over his welfare. I am here because Harry Potter deserves the security of knowing that his safety will never again be subject to the theoretical calculations of those who view children as pawns in larger strategies." She gestured to the evidence table, where months of documentation lay organized in neat stacks. "The evidence before you represents not just one child's suffering, but a pattern of institutional failure that has affected multiple students over multiple years. Harry Potter's case has simply forced us to confront what we have long chosen to ignore. The presentation of evidence took nearly 2 hours. Medical records that traced Harry's gradual recovery from severe malnutrition and psychological trauma. Witness testimonies from neighbors, teachers, and order members who had observed his condition and reported their concerns to authorities who failed to act. Documentation of other students whose welfare had been sacrificed for what Dumbledore termed strategic considerations. Minister Fudge, presiding as an observer rather than a judge, kept glancing between the evidence and the packed public gallery where reporters scribbled furiously, and families of former Hogwarts students waited to hear whether their concerns would finally be validated. The political implications of this trial extended far beyond Harry Potter's custody. They reached into every decision Dumbledore had made regarding student welfare over his decades as headmaster. "The defense will now present its case," Chief Warlock Bagnold announced, and McGonagall watched as Dumbledore rose to address the court. His testimony was a masterclass in political rhetoric, weaving together prophecy, necessity, and the burden of knowledge that he claimed had guided his every decision regarding Harry's placement. "Chief Warlock, I do not stand before you today, claiming that Harry Potter's childhood was ideal," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to commanding attention through wisdom rather than authority. "I stand before you, acknowledging that I made difficult decisions based on information that I alone possessed, decisions that prioritized Harry's ultimate survival over his immediate comfort." He spoke of the prophecy that marked Harry as Voldemort's equal, of blood protection that could only function while Harry remained with Petunia Dursley, of the delicate balance between keeping Harry safe and keeping him humble enough to accept the sacrifices that his destiny would require. The protection afforded by his mother's sacrifice, renewed through her sister's blood, has kept Harry Potter alive through 11 years when countless dark wizards would have gladly murdered him for the fame it would bring them. Yes, his relatives were challenging, but they kept him alive and unknown until he was old enough to defend himself. McGonagall watched the Wizengamott members' faces as Dumbledore spoke, noting how several seemed swayed by his appeals to necessity and sacrifice, but she also noticed Chief Warlock Bagnold's increasingly skeptical expression as the defense continued. "Professor Dumbledore," Bagnold interrupted, "are you testifying that systematic abuse was a necessary component of this protection? That a child could not be kept safe without being starved and psychologically tormented?" "I am testifying that the protection required Harry to remain with blood relatives, regardless of their suitability as caregivers. I had hoped that their care would improve over time, but the protection itself was non-negotiable." "And the reports you received about his condition? The documented evidence of abuse that was brought to your attention repeatedly over the years?" For the first time, Dumbledore's composure wavered slightly. "I weighed those reports against the alternative. A dead child, murdered by Death Eaters who had spent 11 years searching for him. I chose to preserve his life, even at the cost of his happiness." The most damaging testimony came from families who had finally found the courage to speak publicly about Dumbledore's previous decisions. Margaret Clearwater described how Dumbledore had blocked her attempts to remove her daughter Penelope from an abusive stepfather, because the man had connections to suspected Death Eaters that Dumbledore wanted to monitor. Thomas Finch Fletchley spoke about how his reports of his son Justin being sexually assaulted by an older student had been handled internally to avoid scandal, with the victim transferred to another school, while the perpetrator remained at Hogwarts with only private counselling. "How many children," Chief Warlock Bagnold asked after the fourth such testimony, "have been sacrificed for your intelligence-gathering operations and reputation management, Professor Dumbledore?" "I have always acted in what I believed to be the best interests of the wizarding world," Dumbledore replied, but his voice carried less certainty than it had at the beginning of his testimony. The moment that would define the trial came when Harry himself was called to testify. McGonagall had spent weeks working with Healer Morrison to prepare him for this possibility, ensuring that he could speak about his experiences without being re-traumatized by the process. But as she watched him walk to the witness chair, taller now, healthier, but still so young to be carrying the weight of institutional reform on his shoulders, she felt a fierce protective anger that someone so young should be required to justify his own right to safety. Harry's testimony was delivered in the same quiet, factual tone he used when discussing his therapy sessions. No drama, no emotional appeals, just the simple recounting of what his life had been like before McGonagall rescued him. I lived in the cupboard, under the stairs, from the time I was small until my Hogwarts letters started coming, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. It was where I slept, where I kept my things, where I was sent when I did something wrong. I didn't know other children had bedrooms until I started school. He described meals withheld as punishment, being locked outside overnight when he displayed accidental magic, the casual cruelty of relatives who viewed him as a burden they had been unfairly forced to bear. He spoke of believing himself worthless because that was what he had been taught, of learning to be grateful for scraps of basic kindness because he had never experienced unconditional care. When Professor McGonagall first told me I didn't have to go back to the Dursleys, I asked if I had done something wrong, Harry continued. I couldn't understand why someone would want to protect me unless I had somehow earned it. It took months with Healer Morrison for me to understand that children are supposed to be protected just because they exist, not because they've proven themselves worthy of care. The silence that followed Harry's testimony was profound. Several Wizengamott members were openly weeping, and McGonagall could see reporters in the public gallery frantically writing, while family members embraced each other in recognition of long-suppressed truths finally being acknowledged. When Chief Warlock Bagnold asked Harry directly whether he felt safe with McGonagall and wanted to remain in her custody, his answer was immediate and clear. Professor McGonagall is my family now, he said simply. She's the first person who ever made me feel like I mattered just for being myself. I trust her to keep me safe and to love me even when I make mistakes. I want to stay with her. The Wizengamott's deliberation took less than an hour. When they returned, Chief Warlock Bagnold's expression left no doubt about their decision. In the matter of Harry Potter's custody, this court finds that the petitioner, Professor Minerva McGonagall, has demonstrated exceptional care for the minor's welfare and is hereby granted permanent legal guardianship with all associated rights and responsibilities. The ruling continued with a comprehensive condemnation of Dumbledore's decisions and the institutional failures they represented. He was removed from his position on the Hogwarts Board of Governors, stripped of his Order of Merlin First Class, and barred from holding any position involving oversight of minors. More importantly, the court established new mandatory reporting requirements for suspected child abuse, created an independent oversight board for Hogwarts student welfare, and explicitly rejected the interpretation of blood protection that had been used to justify Harry's placement. This court finds that magical protection, which requires a child's systematic abuse, is not protection, but child sacrifice disguised as strategy, Bagnold declared. No theoretical benefit, however significant, can justify the deliberate infliction of suffering upon children in our care. As McGonagall and Harry left the courthouse together, surrounded by reporters shouting questions and well-wishers offering congratulations, McGonagall reflected on how much had changed since that terrible morning in the hospital wing when she first discovered the extent of Harry's suffering. The legal victory was satisfying, but the real triumph walked beside her in the form of a confident young man who had learned to believe in his own worth. The institutional changes were necessary, but the personal transformation was everything. "Are you all right?" she asked Harry as they made their way through the crowd toward the flu network that would take them home. "I'm perfect," Harry replied, and for the first time since she had known him, McGonagall believed he truly meant it. "I have a family who loves me, a home where I'm safe, and laws that will protect other children from what I went through. What could be better than that?" That evening, as they sat together in their cottage, reading the newspaper headlines that proclaimed the trial's outcome to the wizarding world, McGonagall realized that they had achieved something far more significant than legal recognition of their family bond. They had forced an entire society to confront uncomfortable truths about how they treated their most vulnerable members, and they had created protections that would benefit children they would never meet. "The prophet says this will change everything," Harry observed, reading over her shoulder, "that no child will ever again be left in a situation like mine was." "That's the hope," McGonagall replied, "that your courage in telling your story will protect other children from similar suffering." "Then it was worth it," Harry said quietly. "All of it. The testimony, the publicity, having to remember things I'd rather forget. If it keeps other kids safe, it was worth every minute." As McGonagall watched Harry return to his book with the contentment of someone who knew himself loved and valued, she reflected on the lesson this entire experience had taught her. That individual courage, when applied to institutional failures, could create change that rippled far beyond one person's life. Some battles, she had learned, were worth fighting not just for the immediate victory, but for the world they created in their wake. And some victories belonged not to the adults who fought for justice, but to the children who finally received the protection they had always deserved. Chapter 9. New Hogwarts, April 1992. Harry stood at the gates of Hogwarts for the first time in 6 months, his hand secure in McGonagall's as they approached the castle that would now serve as both his school and her workplace. The boy who had left Hogwarts in October as a frightened victim of abuse bore little resemblance to the confident young man returning in April. He had grown nearly 6 inches and gained 2 stone of healthy weight. But the changes that mattered most were visible in his posture, straight and unafraid, and his eyes, alert with curiosity rather than hypervigilance. "Are you ready for this?" McGonagall asked, as they paused at the entrance to the Great Hall, where the student body waited for the official announcement of the reforms that would reshape their school. "I'm ready," Harry replied, and his voice carried none of the uncertainty that had once characterized his every interaction with authority. "I want to see what Hogwarts can become when it actually protects its students." McGonagall felt a surge of pride as they entered the hall together. The transformation of Hogwarts had begun the day after the Wizengamott trial, when she had been formally appointed head mistress with a mandate to implement comprehensive child protection reforms. The changes went far beyond policy updates. They represented a fundamental shift in how the school understood its responsibility to its students. "Students and staff of Hogwarts," McGonagall began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall as conversation stilled. "I am pleased to announce that Harry Potter has returned to continue his education with us. But more importantly, I want to discuss the changes that his courage has made possible for every student in this school." She outlined the new protocols with the precision of someone who had spent months planning their implementation. Mandatory reporting requirements for suspected abuse, regular check-ins with students about their home situations, therapeutic support services available to anyone who needed them, and most significantly, a new position, student welfare advocate, whose sole responsibility was ensuring that every child at Hogwarts felt safe and supported. These changes exist because one student was brave enough to speak his truth, and because we as adults chose to believe him rather than protect our own comfort, McGonagall continued. But they also exist because we refuse to believe that Harry Potter was the only student who needed protection that this school failed to provide. The applause that followed was not the polite recognition typically accorded to administrative announcements, but the genuine appreciation of a community that had been waiting years for someone to acknowledge that student welfare should be the highest priority of any educational institution. Harry's reunion with his friends was everything McGonagall had hoped it would be. She watched from the head table as Hermione Granger launched herself at Harry with a fierce hug that he returned without the careful hesitation that had once marked his physical interactions. "Harry!" Hermione exclaimed, pulling back to study his face with the analytical intensity she brought to everything. "You look amazing, healthy and happy, and taller. You're actually taller than me now." "Proper nutrition will do that," Harry replied, with a grin that was entirely new in McGonagall's experience, spontaneous and genuinely joyful. "Aunt Minerva makes sure I eat actual meals instead of whatever scraps the Dursleys thought I deserved." Ron Weasley's reaction was more subdued, but equally meaningful. The redhead had spent months wrestling with guilt over his family's failure to intervene when they noticed Harry's condition, and his greeting carried the weight of that self-recrimination. "I'm sorry we didn't help sooner," Ron said quietly. "Mum's been crying every night since the trial, saying she should have done something when she saw how thin you were at King's Cross." "There's nothing to apologize for," Harry replied firmly, and McGonagall noted the confidence with which he set boundaries around others' guilt. "You were children. The adults should have been protecting me, and when they failed, other adults stepped in. That's how it's supposed to work." The changes in Harry's academic performance were immediately apparent. Without the constant stress of abuse and neglect weighing on his concentration, his magical abilities had flourished in ways that suggested he might indeed have inherited his parents' considerable talents. His transfiguration work showed particular promise, with McGonagall having to resist the urge to praise him too obviously in front of his classmates. "Mr. Potter," she said, during his first transfiguration lesson back, "your needle-to-matchstick transformation shows remarkable control. Have you been practicing during your time away?" "I've been working with a tutor," Harry replied, and McGonagall smiled at his careful avoidance of mentioning that she had been teaching him advanced techniques during their months together at the cottage. "And I think maybe not being constantly worried about where my next meal was coming from helped me focus better." The honest acknowledgement of his abuse's impact on his learning drew surprised looks from his classmates, but Harry met their gazes without embarrassment. This was another change that McGonagall had observed over months of recovery. Harry no longer felt shame about what had been done to him, only determination to help others avoid similar suffering. The new therapeutic support services proved their worth almost immediately. Within a week of Harry's return, 3 other students had approached the student welfare advocate about problems at home, and 2 more had requested counseling to deal with bullying that had escalated beyond normal childhood conflicts. Luna Lovegood, a first-year Ravenclaw whose ethereal demeanor had hidden serious issues with grief and social isolation following her mother's death, became one of the program's most visible success stories. Under the old system, her odd behavior and academic struggles would have been dismissed as eccentricity. Under the new protocols, she received grief counseling and social skills support that helped her engage with her peers more effectively while maintaining the unique perspective that made her special. "It's like the school finally remembers that we're children," Hermione observed one evening as they studied in the common room. "Not just future adult wizards, but actual kids who need adults to take care of them and make sure we're okay." "That's exactly what it is," Harry replied, looking up from his defense against the dark arts essay. "The difference between treating students as resources to be managed and treating them as people to be protected." Ron, who had initially struggled to adjust to Harry's new assertiveness, was gradually learning to appreciate the changes in his friend. "You're different," he said one afternoon, after Harry had politely but firmly told Seamus Finnegan to stop making jokes about Harry's testimony at the trial. "More. I don't know. Like you know you matter." "I do know I matter," Harry said simply. "I learned that I'm not responsible for other people's comfort with the truth about abuse. I learned that I have the right to feel safe and protected, and that adults who don't provide that protection are failing in their duty, not the other way around." The transformation of Hogwarts extended beyond individual students to the entire culture of the school. Staff meetings now included regular discussions of student welfare concerns. House competitions were restructured to emphasize cooperation and mutual support rather than cutthroat rivalry. Most significantly, the school's relationship with parents and guardians had been fundamentally altered by new policies requiring home visits and welfare checks for students showing signs of distress. "We've had 4 families request transfers to other schools rather than submit to welfare evaluations," McGonagall told Harry during one of their private conversations in her office, "which tells me that those were exactly the families who needed oversight." "What about the students?" Harry asked, his concern for other children's welfare evident in his voice. "All 4 children have been placed in temporary care while their situations are assessed," 3 have already expressed relief at being removed from harmful environments. McGonagall smiled at the satisfaction in Harry's expression. Your case has created protections that extend far beyond Hogwarts. Perhaps the most remarkable change was the gradual emergence of Harry's natural leadership abilities. Without the crushing weight of abuse-induced trauma, his instinctive compassion and moral courage began manifesting in ways that drew other students to him for guidance and support. When a group of older Slytherins attempted to bully a first-year Hufflepuff, Harry intervened not with the reckless heroics that might have been expected, but with the calm authority of someone who understood both the dynamics of abuse and the importance of institutional support. That's not acceptable behavior, he told the Slytherins firmly, positioning himself between them and their intended victim. And if you continue, I'll be reporting it to the student welfare advocate and to your head of house. But if you'd like to talk about why you feel the need to hurt someone smaller than you, I'm willing to listen. The approach, combining clear boundaries with genuine compassion, proved remarkably effective. 2 of the would-be bullies ended up requesting counseling sessions to deal with their own family pressures, while the 3rd simply stopped his aggressive behavior when confronted with consequences and alternatives. Harry's become something special, Hermione observed to McGonagall one afternoon when they encountered each other in the library. Not because he's famous, but because he genuinely cares about making sure other people don't suffer the way he did. He's becoming the person he always had the potential to be, McGonagall replied. Abuse doesn't create character. It distorts and suppresses it. Harry's natural empathy and moral courage were always there. They just needed safety and support to flourish. As the school year drew to a close, McGonagall reflected on the comprehensive changes that 6 months of reform had accomplished. Student reports of abuse or neglect had increased dramatically, not because conditions had worsened, but because children finally trusted that adults would act on their concerns. Academic performance across all houses had improved as students felt safer and more supported. Most importantly, the culture of silence and institutional protection that had enabled abuse for generations had been replaced by a commitment to transparency and child welfare. The final validation of their success came in an unexpected form. A letter from Dumbledore, who had spent the months since his disgrace in seclusion at a remote cottage, reflecting on the consequences of his choices. Minerva, he wrote, I have spent considerable time reviewing the decisions I made regarding Harry Potter and other students under my care. While I believed my actions were justified by larger concerns, I can no longer deny that those justifications were inadequate to excuse the harm caused to children who trusted me to protect them. The reforms you have implemented represent what Hogwarts should always have been. A place where student welfare takes precedence over all other considerations. I am grateful that my failures have been corrected by someone with both the moral courage and practical wisdom to prioritize what truly matters. Harry read the letter with the emotional detachment of someone who had completed the work of processing his trauma and emerged stronger for the effort. He's not asking for forgiveness, Harry observed, handing the letter back to McGonagall. He's just acknowledging that he was wrong. That's something, I suppose. Is it enough? McGonagall asked, curious about Harry's perspective on the man whose decisions had shaped so much of his suffering. It's not about what's enough for me, Harry replied thoughtfully. It's about whether he learned something that might prevent him from making the same mistakes with other children in the future. And I think maybe he did. As they prepared to leave Hogwarts for the summer, Harry's first summer vacation that would be spent in a home where he was loved and valued, McGonagall felt a satisfaction deeper than any professional achievement she had previously accomplished. She had not just saved one child, she had reformed an institution. She had not just provided Harry with safety and love, she had created systemic changes that would protect countless other children. Most importantly, she had helped Harry transform from a victim of abuse into a confident young man whose empathy and courage would make the wizarding world a better place. "Ready to go home?" she asked as they gathered their belongings from her office. "I'm ready," Harry replied, and the simple words carried all the weight of a childhood finally lived as it should have been, with safety, love, and the unshakable knowledge that he deserved both. Chapter 10. The Philosopher's Stone Crisis. June 1992. Harry first noticed Professor Quirrell's increasingly erratic behavior during what should have been a routine Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson on protective charms. The nervous professor had always been jumpy and uncertain, but lately his stutter had worsened, and he seemed to be having conversations with someone who wasn't there, his head tilted as if listening to whispered instructions that only he could hear. "Professor Quirrell keeps touching his turban and wincing," Harry told McGonagall that evening as they reviewed his homework in her private quarters. The domestic routine they had established felt natural now. Harry curled in the comfortable chair by her fireplace, McGonagall at her desk with a cup of tea, both of them stealing glances at each other with the contentment of a family that had found its rhythm. And yesterday he dropped his wand twice during the lesson on counter-curses. That's not normal for any professor, even one as nervous as he is. 6 months ago, Harry would have kept such observations to himself, either out of learned helplessness or fear that drawing attention to problems would somehow make him responsible for solving them. But McGonagall had spent countless hours teaching him that noticing concerning behavior was part of keeping himself and others safe, and that bringing worries to trusted adults was exactly what he should do. "Tell me more about what you've observed," McGonagall said, setting down her quill and giving him her complete attention. This too was part of their new normal. When Harry expressed concern about something, she listened with the seriousness she would give any credible threat assessment. "He's been asking strange questions about the third-floor corridor," Harry continued, his brow furrowed with concentration. "Not directly, but during lessons he keeps bringing up examples about magical protections on valuable objects, and yesterday he asked me to stay after class to discuss whether I'd noticed anything unusual about the castle's security measures." McGonagall felt a cold knot of apprehension form in her stomach. As headmistress, she knew exactly what was hidden on the third floor, protected by wards and magical challenges that should have been impregnable to any single wizard. The Philosopher's Stone had been placed under Hogwarts protection at Dumbledore's request, a decision that the Board of Governors had reluctantly approved before his disgrace. She had been meaning to review the security arrangements, but the demands of implementing child welfare reforms had consumed most of her attention. "Harry," she said carefully, "I want you to stay away from Professor Quirrell outside of required classes. If he asks you to remain after lessons or tries to speak with you privately, you are to leave immediately and come to me. Do you understand?" "Is he dangerous?" Harry asked, and McGonagall noted with pride that his question carried concern rather than the paralyzing fear that might once have characterized his response to potential threats. "I don't know yet," she replied honestly. "But something you've described suggests he may be taking an inappropriate interest in school security, and until I can investigate properly, I want you protected." That night, McGonagall conducted a thorough review of the magical protections surrounding the stone, and what she found alarmed her considerably. Several of the defensive measures showed signs of careful probing, not breached, but tested by someone with significant knowledge of advanced magical theory. More concerning still, the monitoring charms that should have alerted her to any unauthorized approach to the third floor had been subtly altered to create blind spots in the surveillance. She called an emergency meeting with the heads of houses and Madame Pomfrey, people she had learned to trust completely during the difficult months of reform and rebuilding. "We have a serious security breach," she announced without preamble, spreading detection charts across her desk. "Someone has been systematically testing the defenses around the Philosopher's Stone, and they've demonstrated both the knowledge and power to circumvent multiple layers of protection. Professor Flitwick's expertise in defensive charms proved invaluable as he analyzed the magical signatures left behind by the intruder. "This is sophisticated work," he said grimly, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by professional focus. "Whoever did this understands both the theoretical principles and practical applications of ward breaking at a level that suggests either extensive academic study or considerable real-world experience with illegal magical entry." "Any of our colleagues capable of this level of work?" McGonagall asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Quirrell," Sprout said immediately. His academic credentials were always impressive, despite his nervous demeanor. And he's been asking odd questions about magical security during staff meetings. "He's also been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior," Pumphrey added. "Severe headaches, personality changes, periods where he seems to be responding to stimuli that aren't there. I've offered medical evaluation twice, but he's declined." McGonagall felt the pieces of a disturbing puzzle clicking into place. "I'm calling in Aura support. If Quirrell is indeed attempting to steal the stone, this is far beyond the scope of school security to handle." "What about the students?" Flitwick asked. "If there's a serious threat in the castle?" "Enhanced protection protocols go into effect immediately," McGonagall decided. "No student travels alone. All evening activities are suspended, and I want additional wards around the dormitories. If this escalates, we'll evacuate if necessary." The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Led by Aura Captain Kingsley Shacklebolt, a team of magical law enforcement specialists placed Quirrell under surveillance while conducting detailed analysis of the compromised security measures. What they discovered exceeded even McGonagall's worst fears. "Professor Quirrell is not acting alone," Shacklebolt reported during a private briefing in McGonagall's office. "Our investigation has revealed evidence of possession, specifically possession by an extremely powerful dark wizard whose magical signature matches historical records of Tom Riddle, also known as Lord Voldemort." Harry, who had been present for the briefing at McGonagall's insistence that he understand the threats he faced, went very pale but remained composed. "He's been in the castle all year," Harry said quietly, "teaching defense classes, having access to students." "Which is why we're taking immediate action," Shacklebolt assured him. "This is not a situation where we wait to see what happens next. Professor Quirrell will be apprehended tonight, and the stone will be moved to a more secure location immediately." "What about Harry?" McGonagall asked, her maternal instincts overriding her professional demeanor. "If Voldemort is here because of him, Mr. Potter will be under constant aura protection until the threat is neutralized," Shacklebolt replied. "But based on our assessment, Quirrell's primary objective appears to be the stone itself, not specifically targeting the boy. The possession likely occurred independently of any plot against Harry Potter." That evening, as Aura teams moved into position around the castle, Harry sat in McGonagall's quarters trying to focus on a transfiguration essay, while processing the knowledge that his parents' murderer had been teaching his defense classes for an entire year. "Are you all right?" McGonagall asked, settling into her chair with her own stack of papers, though she had no more ability to concentrate on administrative work than Harry had to focus on homework. "I'm scared," Harry admitted, and McGonagall felt a rush of pride at his honest acknowledgement of a normal emotional response to abnormal circumstances. "But I'm also relieved, I think, that I don't have to figure out how to handle this by myself." "You will never have to handle threats like this by yourself," McGonagall said firmly. "That's what adults are for, to protect children from dangers they shouldn't have to face alone." The confrontation with Quirrell took place in the early hours of the morning, when the possessed professor finally made his move toward the stone's hiding place. Aura teams were waiting for him, and the arrest proceeded with minimal damage to castle property, and no danger to students who remained safely in their dormitories under protective wards. Quirrell's removal from Voldemort's influence required the combined efforts of 3 specialists in magical possession, a process that left the professor alive but permanently damaged by his months as an unwilling host. The fragment of Voldemort's soul that had been sustaining itself through the possession was destroyed during the extraction, eliminating the immediate threat while providing valuable intelligence about the Dark Lord's current state and capabilities. Voldemort is weak, Shacklebolt explained to Harry and McGonagall the next morning as they reviewed the results of the investigation. This appears to have been a desperate attempt to obtain the stone's power for resurrection rather than a coordinated attack. The destruction of the soul fragment that was possessing Quirrell has likely set back any other attempts significantly. So Harry is safe? McGonagall asked. From this particular threat, yes. But we'd be foolish to assume that Voldemort won't eventually find other ways to regain power. The important thing is that we've demonstrated that proper adult intervention can handle these situations without putting children at risk. The aftermath of the crisis proved as important as the resolution itself. The news that Harry Potter had been protected from Voldemort's influence by competent adult intervention rather than left to face mortal danger alone resonated powerfully throughout the wizarding community. Letters poured in from families expressing relief that the boy who lived was being properly safeguarded rather than expected to solve problems that should be handled by trained professionals. The Daily Prophet wants an interview, McGonagall told Harry a few days later, as they walked through the castle grounds, enjoying the peaceful afternoon after the crisis had passed. About how you handled learning about the threat, about what it means for adults to take responsibility for protecting you. What would I say? Harry asked, genuinely curious rather than anxious about media attention. Whatever you want to say, McGonagall replied. But I think people need to understand that protecting children from adult dangers doesn't make them weak. It allows them to be strong in age-appropriate ways. Harry considered this as they settled beneath his favorite tree near the lake, a spot that had become their informal outdoor office during pleasant weather. I want people to know that being protected doesn't mean being helpless, he said finally. I noticed Professor Quirrell's behavior because I've learned to pay attention to things that don't feel safe. I told you about it because I've learned to trust that adults will take my concerns seriously. I stayed out of the way during the actual danger because I've learned that there's a difference between being brave and being foolishly reckless. Those are all exactly the lessons we hoped you would learn, McGonagall said with satisfaction. And I want other kids to know that they deserve the same protection, Harry continued, that they shouldn't have to face adult problems alone, no matter how famous or special they might be. The interview, when it appeared in the Prophet a week later, became one of the most widely read articles in the newspaper's history. Harry's calm, thoughtful discussion of appropriate childhood protection in the face of adult threats sparked a broader conversation about how the wizarding world treated its young people, particularly those who found themselves in dangerous circumstances. You've started something important, McGonagall told Harry, as they read the responses that flooded in from across magical Britain. People are finally understanding that protecting children is everyone's responsibility, not just their families. As the school year drew to a close, McGonagall reflected on how differently the stone crisis had unfolded than it might have under the old system. Instead of children facing mortal danger alone, while adults remained oblivious or deliberately absent, proper oversight and immediate response had neutralized the threat with minimal risk to anyone. Harry had played his appropriate role, observing, reporting, and trusting adults to handle adult problems, rather than being forced into premature heroics that could have cost him his life. Are you disappointed? She asked Harry one evening, as they prepared for the end-of-term feast. That you didn't get to face Voldemort dramatically and prove your courage? Harry looked at her with the patient expression he wore when adults asked questions that seemed to miss obvious points. Aunt Minerva, he said gently, I've already proven my courage. I survived 11 years of abuse and still learned how to love and trust people. I spoke out about what was done to me, even when it was terrifying and difficult. I changed my entire world by refusing to accept that suffering was normal. He smiled, the brilliant, unconscious smile that never failed to make her heart skip. I don't need to fight dark wizards to prove I'm brave. As McGonagall tucked that wisdom away with all the other reminders of how remarkable Harry had become, she felt deep satisfaction in the knowledge that they had successfully redefined what heroism looked like for children in their care. Some victories, she had learned, were measured not by dramatic confrontations won, but by normal childhoods, preserved and protected against all odds. Chapter 11. Building a Family, August 1992. Harry's second summer at the cottage felt different from his first in ways both subtle and profound. Where the previous year had been about healing and learning to trust that care was genuine, this summer was about the deep contentment of belonging somewhere completely. McGonagall watched him tend their garden with the unconscious ease of someone who knew this was his home in every way that mattered, not just a safe place he was temporarily allowed to occupy. "The tomatoes are ready," Harry called from where he knelt among the vegetable plants they had started together in the spring. "Should I pick them for lunch?" "Please," McGonagall replied from her spot at the kitchen window, where she was watching him with the quiet satisfaction that had become her default emotional state over the past months. She had never expected to discover maternal instincts at her age, had never imagined that watching a child grow and flourish under her care would bring her more joy than any professional achievement she had accomplished in 4 decades of teaching. They had developed rituals over the year they had been together, small traditions that belonged only to them and marked the rhythm of their shared life. Saturday morning pancakes with Harry attempting increasingly elaborate magical cooking techniques under her guidance. Evening walks around the cottage grounds, where they discussed everything from academic theory to Harry's growing understanding of his place in the wizarding world. Thursday tea times, when they would sit together in comfortable silence, reading their respective books, but sharing the space in the way that only family could. "Aunt Minerva," Harry said, as they prepared lunch together, their movements around the kitchen synchronized by months of practice. "Healer Morrison wants to reduce our sessions to once a month instead of weekly. She says I've made remarkable progress." McGonagall felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with her role as his guardian and everything to do with Harry's own resilience and courage. "How do you feel about that?" "Ready," Harry said immediately, then paused to consider his words more carefully. "I still have hard days sometimes. I still catch myself apologizing for existing or hoarding food when I'm stressed. But I understand now that those are just old habits, not who I really am. And I know that if something gets overwhelming, I can always ask for help." The transformation was visible in every aspect of Harry's development. His academic work had flourished beyond McGonagall's most optimistic expectations. His essays showed the kind of analytical thinking and creative problem-solving that marked truly gifted students, abilities that had been completely suppressed during his years of survival-focused existence with the Dursleys. His magical abilities had grown stronger and more controlled as his body and mind healed from chronic stress, and McGonagall had begun introducing him to advanced techniques that challenged his considerable potential. "I've been thinking about career possibilities," Harry said one afternoon as they worked together on a particularly complex transfiguration exercise that involved reshaping the molecular structure of organic materials. "I know I'm only 12, but I like understanding how things work, how to fix things that are broken." "What kind of things?" McGonagall asked, noting how his natural aptitude for healing and protection had emerged more strongly as he gained confidence. "People, mostly. Laws that don't protect children the way they should. Systems that let vulnerable people fall through cracks." Harry completed the transfiguration with casual precision, turning a wilted flower into a thriving plant with roots strong enough to survive transplanting. "I think I might want to work in magical law someday, or maybe become a mind healer like Healer Morrison." McGonagall felt her heart swell with the recognition that Harry's traumatic experiences, rather than breaking him, had developed in him an extraordinary capacity for empathy and a drive to protect others from similar suffering. "Those are worthy goals," she said. and you have several years to explore different possibilities. The introduction to her extended family had been something McGonagall had approached with careful planning and considerable anxiety. Her relationship with Harry was so central to her identity now that she worried about how her relatives would respond to their unconventional family structure. But her concerns proved groundless. Harry charmed her elderly cousins with his genuine interest in family stories and his polite but confident interactions with adults, while her friends from teaching found him delightful company who could discuss magical theory with impressive sophistication while still maintaining the curiosity and wonder appropriate to his age. "Your aunt is magnificent," her cousin Margaret told Harry during a family gathering at the cottage. But then, she always was the one who would stand up for what was right, no matter the personal cost. "She saved my life," Harry replied simply. "Not just from the Dursleys, but from becoming someone bitter and afraid. She taught me that I deserve love and protection, and now I want to make sure other kids learn that too." The conversation that followed, as Harry confidently discussed child welfare reform and his own role in changing protective laws, left McGonagall's relatives with no doubt about the remarkable young man he was becoming. Perhaps most surprisingly to McGonagall, Harry had begun showing signs of healthy romantic interest. Nothing serious at 12 years old, but the normal development of crushes and social awareness that had been completely suppressed during his traumatic childhood. She watched with maternal pride and amusement as he developed a shy fascination with Hermione Granger's brilliant mind and fierce loyalty, and later as he blushed furiously when Luna Lovegood complimented his kindness toward younger students. "Is it normal to feel nervous about talking to girls?" Harry asked one evening, the question delivered with the careful casualness of someone who had learned that he could discuss anything with the adult who cared for him. "Completely normal," McGonagall assured him. "The fact that you're developing healthy social interests is actually wonderful progress. It means you feel secure enough to think about forming connections beyond just ensuring your survival." Harry's advocacy for other students had become increasingly sophisticated as he grew more confident in his own voice. He had established a peer support group at Hogwarts for students dealing with difficult family situations, worked with the student welfare advocate to identify children who might benefit from additional support, and had begun corresponding with other schools about implementing similar child protection programs. "I got a letter from a student at Durmstrang," Harry told McGonagall excitedly one afternoon. "They want to know how we convinced adults to take student welfare concerns seriously. I told them the most important thing was finding one adult who was willing to put children's safety above institutional reputation." McGonagall felt tremendous pride in Harry's understanding that individual courage could create systemic change, and in his ability to articulate that knowledge in ways that empowered other young people to advocate for themselves. The conversation about Harry's surname came up naturally one evening as they reviewed legal documents related to his inheritance and educational planning. McGonagall had been helping him understand the properties and investments he had inherited, ensuring that he could make informed decisions about his financial future. "All these documents have me listed as Harry James Potter," Harry said thoughtfully, "but that doesn't feel complete anymore. Potter was my birth name, but McGonagall is my family name now." "Would you want to legally change your name?" McGonagall asked, her heart racing at the implication that Harry wanted to make their family bond official in every possible way. "Could I become Harry James Potter McGonagall?" Harry asked. "I don't want to lose my connection to my birth parents, but I want people to know that you're my real family now." The legal name change process took several weeks, but the moment Harry signed the documents that officially made him Harry James Potter McGonagall, McGonagall felt a completeness she hadn't even realized she had been missing. They were family, not just in affection and daily life, but in law and public recognition. "How does it feel?" she asked, as they left the ministry office where the name change had been finalized. "Like coming home," Harry said simply. "Like finally being who I was always supposed to be." As they prepared for Harry's second year at Hogwarts, McGonagall reflected on the remarkable young man he had become. At 13, he possessed the confidence to advocate for himself and others, the empathy to understand different perspectives, the intellectual curiosity to engage with complex problems, and the emotional stability to form healthy relationships. But perhaps most importantly, he had developed an unshakable understanding of his own worth that would protect him from the kind of manipulation and abuse that had characterized his early childhood. "I'm proud of you," she told him one evening, as they packed his school trunk with the care of people who knew they would see each other soon and often. "I'm proud of us," Harry corrected gently. "We saved each other, didn't we? You saved me from the Dursleys and taught me how to be loved. I saved you from a life of regret about not acting when children needed protection." McGonagall realized he was exactly right. Their rescue had been mutual. She had given him safety and love, but he had given her purpose and the joy of watching someone flourish under genuine care. They had created something together that neither of them could have achieved alone. A family built on choice rather than obligation, strengthened by shared values rather than bound by duty. "Are you ready to go back to school?" she asked, as they prepared for the new term. "I'm ready for anything," Harry replied, with the quiet confidence of someone who knew himself loved unconditionally. "I have a family who believes in me, friends who care about me, and the knowledge that I deserve good things in my life. Whatever challenges come next, I can handle them." As McGonagall watched him board the Hogwarts Express with his friends, his posture straight and his smile genuine, she felt the deep satisfaction of work well done. She had not just rescued one child from abuse. She had helped him become the kind of person who would spend his life protecting others from similar harm. The boy who had once believed himself worthless was now a confident young man who understood his value and potential. The child who had once survived by making himself invisible was now someone who used his voice to advocate for positive change. Most importantly, the son she had chosen, and who had chosen her in return, was growing into exactly the kind of person the wizarding world needed, someone who combined power with compassion, intelligence with empathy, and strength with kindness. Some families, McGonagall had learned, were not born but built through daily acts of love, commitment, and the courage to put a child's well-being above all other considerations. And some children, given the chance to heal and grow in safety, could transform not only their own lives, but the world around them. Harry James Potter McGonagall was proof that love, when freely given and consistently maintained, could overcome even the most devastating early trauma. As she watched his train disappear around the bend, McGonagall felt grateful beyond words that she had been given the opportunity to help him discover who he truly was, and to discover, in the process, the depth of her own capacity for maternal love. Chapter 12. Legacy of Change. September 1997. Harry Potter McGonagall stood at the podium in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, looking out at an audience that represented the most comprehensive gathering of child welfare advocates in magical history. At 16, he possessed the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to transform personal trauma into purposeful action, his presence commanding attention not through fame, but through genuine authority, earned by helping others heal from experiences he understood intimately. 5 years ago, Harry began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, I was a child who believed I deserved nothing more than a cupboard under the stairs and whatever scraps of food my relatives felt like giving me. I'm standing here today because one adult decided that my worth was not determined by my usefulness, my compliance, or my ability to stay invisible. McGonagall sat in the front row, watching with the profound satisfaction of someone whose decision to act with courage had rippled outward in ways she could never have imagined when she first saw Harry's medical file 6 years ago. The International Conference on Child Protection in Magical Communities was meeting at Hogwarts for the first time, drawing delegates from 17 countries who had come to study the reforms that had become known throughout the magical world as the McGonagall Protocols. The transformation of Magical Britain's approach to child welfare had exceeded even her most optimistic projections. What had begun as an emergency intervention to save one abused boy had evolved into comprehensive systemic change that had fundamentally altered how magical communities worldwide thought about their responsibilities to their youngest members. The statistics tell part of the story, Harry continued, referencing the documentation that had been distributed to all conference attendees. Since the implementation of the McGonagall Protocols, reports of suspected child abuse in Magical Britain have increased by 300%. Not because more children are being harmed, but because more adults have learned to recognize abuse and act on their concerns. Successful interventions have increased by 400%. Most importantly, follow-up studies show that 92% of children removed from harmful situations under the new protocols report feeling safer and more supported than before intervention. McGonagall felt tears prick at her eyes as she listened to Harry present evidence of how many children's lives had been changed by the precedent his case had established. Representatives from magical communities in France, Germany, Bulgaria, and even as far away as Australia had implemented similar programs based on Hogwarts' model, creating a network of protection that spanned continents. But the changes went deeper than policy implementation. The cultural shift toward prioritizing child welfare had transformed magical society in ways both subtle and profound. Families that might once have hidden domestic problems behind closed doors now sought help before situations became desperate. Educational institutions had restructured their priorities to focus on student well-being alongside academic achievement. Most significantly, the magical world had begun to understand that protecting children was not just a moral obligation, but an investment in a healthier, more compassionate future. The real measure of our success, Harry said, his gaze finding McGonagall in the audience, is not in the policies we've created, but in the children who will never know the fear of being unwanted because we've built a world that values their safety above all other considerations. After the formal presentation, McGonagall found Harry in her private office, where he was reviewing applications for the Potter-McGonagall Foundation for Child Welfare, the organization they had established together to fund child protection programs throughout the magical world. At 16, Harry had insisted on taking an active role in the Foundation's work, using both his inherited wealth and his public platform to advocate for vulnerable children. Mrs. Chen from the Shanghai Institute wants to establish a training program for magical social workers, Harry told her, looking up from a letter written in elegant script. She says they've had remarkable success with early intervention programs based on our model, but they need more specialized professionals to handle complex cases. What do you think? McGonagall asked, settling into her chair with the cup of tea that had become an essential part of their evening routine over the years. I think we approve the funding, Harry said immediately. And I'd like to visit their program this summer, if you can arrange the time away from Hogwarts. I want to understand how different cultures adapt child protection principles to their specific needs. McGonagall nodded, noting with pride how Harry's commitment to child welfare had evolved from personal healing to global advocacy. His plans for his adult career had crystallized around his passion for systemic change. He would complete his magical law degree and then establish a practice specializing in child advocacy, with the goal of eventually working at the international level to strengthen protections for magical children worldwide. There's something else, Harry said, his tone shifting to the kind of careful consideration he used when broaching topics that carried emotional weight. I've been corresponding with a group of young people who are organizing support networks for abuse survivors. They want me to write something. A letter to children who are currently in situations like mine was, offering hope and practical advice about seeking help. How do you feel about that? McGonagall asked, recognizing both the therapeutic value and potential emotional cost of such a project. Ready, Harry said simply. I think I've learned enough about healing and strength to offer guidance that might help other kids believe they deserve better." That evening, McGonagall found Harry at the desk in his room, working on the letter with the focused intensity he brought to projects that mattered deeply to him. The teenager who bent over the parchment bore no resemblance to the frightened, malnourished child she had rescued 6 years ago. Harry had grown tall and strong, his magical abilities flourishing under proper care and training. But the changes that mattered most were invisible. The confidence with which he moved through the world, the healthy relationships he had formed, the unshakable understanding of his own worth that protected him from the kind of manipulation that had once defined his existence. His romantic relationship with Luna Lovegood had developed with the natural ease of two people who had both learned to value authenticity over performance. McGonagall watched them together, with the satisfaction of seeing Harry experience the kind of normal teenage affection that had been impossible during his traumatic childhood. Luna's gentle wisdom complemented Harry's passionate advocacy, and together they represented the kind of healthy partnership that emerged when both people understood their individual worth. "Dear friend," Harry had written, "I know you might feel like no one cares whether you're safe or happy. I know adults might have told you that love has to be earned through perfect behavior and complete silence about things that hurt. I want you to know that those adults are wrong." The letter continued with the kind of practical wisdom that could only come from someone who had survived systematic abuse and emerged whole. Harry offered concrete advice about identifying trusted adults, recognizing that abuse was never the victim's fault, and understanding that seeking help was an act of courage rather than betrayal. But most importantly, he offered hope, the promise that healing was possible, that life could become beautiful, that they deserved safety and love simply by virtue of existing. "You don't have to save yourself alone," the letter concluded. "There are adults whose job it is to protect children, and when you find the right ones, they will help you discover who you truly are beneath all the fear and pain. You are worthy of every good thing this world has to offer. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." 3 days later, McGonagall stood in the kitchen of their cottage, preparing Harry's favourite breakfast on the morning of his 16th birthday. 6 years of shared mornings had made their domestic routine as natural as breathing, but she never took for granted the miracle of watching Harry flourish under genuine care and attention. "Happy birthday," she said, as Harry entered the kitchen, his hair still tousled from sleep, and his expression carrying the contentment of someone who knew himself completely loved. "Thank you," Harry replied, accepting the plate of eggs and toast with the easy affection that had replaced his once automatic gratitude for basic necessities. "And thank you for everything else, for saving me, for teaching me how to be loved, for showing me that I could use my experiences to help other people instead of just surviving them." McGonagall felt her throat tighten with emotion as she recognized the moment she had been waiting for without realizing it. The moment when Harry fully understood not just what she had done for him, but what they had accomplished together. "You saved yourself, Harry," she said gently. "I just provided the safety for you to do the work." Harry was quiet for a moment, studying her face with the kind of loving attention that had become his default expression when looking at her. "Mum," he said quietly, and the word hung in the air between them like a gift neither had dared to hope for. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for teaching me that I was worth saving." McGonagall's tears came freely then, the culmination of 6 years of love and worry and profound joy at watching a broken child become a remarkable young man. "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting me be your mother, for teaching me that love isn't just about protection, but about helping someone discover their own strength." As they sat together at their kitchen table, sharing breakfast and comfortable silence, McGonagall reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a teacher's moral obligation to protect a student had become the defining relationship of both their lives, a family built on choice and sustained by mutual respect, shared values, and unconditional love. Outside their cottage, the wizarding world continued to evolve in ways both large and small, shaped by the understanding that protecting children was everyone's responsibility. The boy who had once believed himself worthless had become a young man whose advocacy would protect countless other children from similar suffering. The teacher who had once trusted institutional authority above her own moral instincts had become a leader whose courage had fundamentally changed how magical society understood its obligations to its most vulnerable members. But inside their kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on love rather than survival, Harry Potter McGonagall and his mother simply enjoyed the quiet miracle of a family that had chosen itself and flourished because of that choice. Some rescues, McGonagall had learned, became transformations. Some acts of courage rippled outward to change not just individual lives, but the understanding of what love and protection should mean for every child fortunate enough to receive them. In the end, saving Harry Potter had not just been about one boy's welfare. It had been about proving that individual courage, when applied to institutional failures, could create a world where no child would ever again be considered expendable for someone else's vision of the greater good. And in the quiet contentment of a 16-year-old calling her mum for the first time, McGonagall found the deepest satisfaction any parent could know. The knowledge that love, freely given and consistently maintained, had helped someone discover exactly who they were meant to be.